All right.
Which is cool.
Boogaloo. Mics are on.
Hello. You good?
Yeah, I'm good.
You gonna pour some water?
Oh, yes.
Oh yeah, look at that.
Which is good.
Do you want
I
one?
can pour. Do you want some?
Oh,
You can.
oops. What's up? Oh yeah. Hey, the mic's on. Mike, I can hear us whispering.
They can hear us. They can hear everything you're saying.
We're talking.
It's kind of like the Russian government or Chinese government. They can hear everything you're saying. Or the Emirati government.
Just whisper.
Or the Venezuelan government. It's on and on and on. And why are they listening to us? And that's the subject that we're going to discuss
All
today.
right.
Thank you for coming. We're very grateful that you're here. We are... Yep, feel free to clap for them. This is superb.
Casey Michelle, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to set up the problem, and then I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then we're going to go forward. For years, it's been very frustrating being in a human rights organization because most human rights organizations are focused on the violation of human rights. But in reality, the violation of human rights almost always has everything to do with government corruption. Government corruption is the other side of the coin of human rights violations. The reason journalists are imprisoned or eliminated is because they're talking about what people in government are doing. And it's not that what they're doing is bad policy, it's they're stealing money. Whether it's in Mexico, in Russia, in Angola, in Venezuela, journalists, private citizens blow the whistle, government clamps down on it. Why does government clamp down on freedom of expression? Because freedom of expression is what you use to talk about government corruption. The central objective of every dictatorship is not nation building. It is all about acquiring loot for those in power, whether it's a political party, such as the CCP, which is the largest collection of billionaires on planet Earth. Most of them, no one has ever heard of them, yet the CCP is the largest collection of billionaires. And what these people do is they, with the money, with the loot that they have, and it's kind of sad, but the Cold War was a set of corrupt Soviet officials with their fancy cars and their privileges that they did not give to the workers, but with an economy that really was not working well because there was no incentive to do so. They swapped for a Western-style economy, became incredibly rich, and then used that wealth to corrupt us in the West. That's the general setup that I want to give in terms of what the problem is and some of the solutions we're going to discuss. So, on your left is Casey Michelle. Casey Michelle is someone that we've been familiar with at the Human Rights Foundation for a very, very long time. We've been in conversations. He's a brilliant researcher. He's a journalist who covers all sorts of transnational corruption, foreign intelligence, and kleptocracy. All of this is the same thing. To us, it's all the same. It's always the same objective: acquire as much loot as possible. At present, Casey is an adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy Initiative. And he just published a book a couple of months ago called American Kleptocracy. Now, on the couch is Joyce Etutu. She's one of the youngest senior reporters at the BBC. She's currently based out of Nairobi, Kenya, and she covers the East Africa region for the BBC. In 2021, she led a groundbreaking journalistic investigation into the pervasive amount of corruption during the Joseph Kabila regime, which we should remember replaced the Mobutu Sese Seko regime, which was entirely also about corruption, and he was very famous because he used to walk around with these leopard hats and had palaces, multiple palaces in the south of France. Also on the couch is Paul Mazzaro. I should start off by giving a disclaimer. The views that Paul is going to express here are his own and do not represent the official position of the United States government. He is a senior policy advisor for counter-corruption and sanctions at the US. Now, all three of them have Twitter accounts. They can tell you what their Twitter accounts are. I follow all of them. In fact, this panel came to be because of a conversation that we were having on Twitter. So I'm just going to throw it out there. Go for it.
Well, I'm not going to lead with my Twitter account. We'll save that for the end. But what Thor laid out here at the very beginning is exactly right. And I think it's something that everyone here already knows. We're not talking about anything that I think most of you aren't already familiar with. Thank you. One of the previous speakers that we had on stage earlier, Bakr from Kyrgyzstan, now in Ukraine, wonderful presentation. But he had a line in there that stuck out to me, and I'm sure to others as well. When he said to the effect of, there is no such thing as a local corruption story anymore. There's no such thing as a single corrupt regime or a single corrupt country. Corruption in the 21st century transcends borders, transcends hemispheres. Corruption doesn't remain in one place, remain with one person, remain with one network. That money, that dirty money, that illicit wealth does not stay in that country of origin, does not stay with that initial industry. That dirty money is always looking to be washed clean. And this is the linkage, this is the tether of all these regimes that we're talking about, all these figures, all these officials that we're talking about. They're looking to make money. And beyond that, they're looking to hide that money because they want to control it. They want access to it whenever, however they want, regardless of consequences, and certainly so that none of it can ever be tracked, ever be traced, ever be tied to them. They want that money anonymously. They want that money without any of us, any researchers, tax authorities, journalists, whomever, being able to tie it directly to them, because we know what happens when that money is tied directly to them. We saw it in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, in 2010. We have seen it elsewhere around the world. Revolution, pushback, overthrow, when that wealth is associated directly with that regime in power. And again, I'm sure this is material you're all perfectly familiar with. You know, what I work on is how the broader West fits in this, and especially how the United States of America fits in this. As you may be able to tell, I am an American by birth, by trade, and I look at how the US has transformed over the last 20, 25, 30 years into one of the go-to jurisdictions for all of this illicit money. Why is it that it's the shell companies in the American states of Delaware and Nevada, the American real estate market, the American private equity and hedge fund market, the American art market, that the Kabilas of the world or other dictators, other autocrats are going to? What are the systems that they're using? What are the policies that they're exploiting? What does it mean for the rest of us? Because there is no local corruption story. It doesn't just affect those in DRC. It doesn't just affect those in Kyrgyzstan. It doesn't just affect those in any other country. It affects those that are providing the tools as well, as we've seen, especially in the US in the past few years, which is why it's important, if nothing else, for those of us who live and work and operate in the West to realize we are the ones providing these tools of anonymity. We are the ones providing these money laundering tools, these pro-kleptocracy tools that all of these autocrats that we're talking about today use and need, and beyond that, abuse for their own personal gain.
Now, you're talking about the anonymity. Let's focus a little more on that, because I've always encouraged human rights defenders that the soft side, the soft underbelly, the vulnerability of dictatorship is its corruption. Although in the West, people say, well, what? Of course they're corrupt. It's a dictatorship. People in the West, they wash their hands from that perspective, and they say it's because of that. It's not, that part's not that relevant to them. They're more interested in human rights violations. What are they doing in regards to torture and freedom of expression and so on and so forth? And what I tell them, it's a two-front war when you are a human rights defender. You want to focus on corruption locally, because locally, people may be like, I don't care about freedom of expression. I care about feeding my family. I care about making it through another week. But if you tell them about corruption, that really gets them going. In fact, people forget that the overthrow of the Tunisian dictatorship had everything to do with corruption. The overthrow of Mubarak had everything to do with corruption. In fact, the spark that started the Tunisian spring was when a fruit seller was being shaken down by the police, and he refused to pay, and so he set fire to himself. And he was just done with it. The leaks from the US State Department were happening around this time, and people were printing the State Department cables, where State Department people in Tunisia were writing to State Department people in the United States saying the level of corruption here is insane. The president's son has his own private zoo. In Carthage, he has a mansion. All of these things. And then this spread like wildfire through Tunisia. And it's corruption that is their soft underbelly. And in the West, we're focused on human rights violations. I say let's tell the West about the human rights violations, and let's tell the dictatorships, people living under them, about what's going on in their countries. I mean, is that something that you would agree with?
No, I thought you're exactly right. And again, this gets to what we've been talking about today. I'm sure we'll be talking about for the next few days, how these regimes, how these figures, how these networks increasingly resemble one another. It is becoming increasingly difficult to disentangle the unique elements to these regimes because how modern kleptocracy works, operates, because the ease of access to all of these broader offshoring networks, how it is they move their money, how it is they hide their money. They're using the same systems, the same networks, the same policies, the same enablers, as we call them. These are the Western lawyers and accountants and real estate agents, over and again.
So Thor, I think what you're pointing at, in summary, is that no one wants leaders who steal from them. You know, whatever you think about democracy, the East, the West, human rights, you know, okay, these are Western concepts. Okay, but we can all unite around, we don't want leaders who are stealing from us. Everybody, Russia, China, whatever. One of the biggest problems that Casey points out with the enablers question is, these, you know, Ukrainians, others, have seen how Western lawyers and accountants and banks and so on and so forth, real estate professionals, have taken this dirty money, and that damages our legitimacy. So we've faced this really just escalating problem where, on the one hand, our governments go abroad and say, we need you to fight corruption, we need to see these reforms, and on the other hand, all that money ends up in our system. You know, so we look hypocritical.
I was going to say, just to jump in real quickly, you were talking about Tunisia in 2011. The Ukraine example in 2013, 2014, also sparked by corruption from the government of Viktor Yanukovych, obviously eventually overthrown, and you can have a direct line from that revolution to where we are right now. Now, without going into too much detail, it just so happens that the formerly corrupt president, Viktor Yanukovych of Ukraine, was working with a number of Western figures, a number of Western
He sure
systems.
was.
There's one gentleman in particular named, some of you may be familiar with, named Paul Manafort, who was a now pardoned former campaign manager for former President Donald Trump, who was connected to a number of regimes, helping and aiding these offshoring networks writ large. And it's funny because I think the first time I ever came across Mr. Manafort's name was his work, not in Ukraine, but I believe it was the DRC for former President Mobutu. And I don't know if he worked with President Kabila, but maybe, Joyce, you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I wanted to essentially touch on that you mentioned earlier was this whole notion of networks, right? So when I worked on the investigation, and I fronted it for the BBC, but you know, we worked in collaboration with the with a company called Mediapart, as well as the platform to protect whistleblowers in Africa. And what was really interesting is that we were essentially exploring the networks that allow this kind of thing to continue, you know, to happen, to perpetuate. So, for example, we looked at Joseph Kabila, but it was very difficult to actually tie him to any of the money that was going in and out of his accounts. We could tie it to his brother, for example. We could tie it to his sister. We could tie it to his friend or his in-laws. But the actual person at the heart of this was extremely difficult to do. And as you say, it's because those networks are there and they are created in place to make it extremely difficult to actually link the person who most people would say is most responsible to actually benefiting from the source of public funds.
So I'm sure we could talk about this for far more time than we've been allotted. Before we turn to the biggest, what I'd say is the most influential of the corrupt, actually no, I'd like to ask each of you, which government do you believe is the most corrupt in the world? Pick the top three, and then tell me which government in the West have been most affected by them. Why don't you start, Paul?
Top three, boy. I mean, the dictatorships, of course, but you know, there's other states that are like middlemen states that provide basically laundering services like UAE or Switzerland, and then there are those destination states like the USA or the UK. I mean, the really big places that are ruled through corrupt systems are China, Russia, Venezuela. I mean, just the very consolidated.
Is that your top three?
Sure.
China, Russia, Venezuela. Now, top three in terms of how rotten the system is, or top three in terms of the sheer amounts of money stolen?
Top three in terms of the consolidated dictatorship based on corruption.
Okay. How about you, Joyce?
I mean, I think that's such a difficult question to answer. And I mean, I think for me, it's one of those things where I wouldn't be able to say because I don't think I know enough about, other regions outside of the African context, in order to be able to directly say.
So then pick Africa. Stick to Africa.
Stick to Africa. Even still, I still think it's a really complex and a complicated one to give three solid answers to. What do you think, Casey?
Well, I was going to say, we have so many options, unfortunately, to choose from, whether it's the countries themselves or certainly the reforms that we have to pass in countries like those in the West. I mean, I think Paul laid out a wonderful list of candidates, certainly in terms of magnitude. You have to look at China first because of the actual depth of capital available to them, and certainly the billionaire class in China, and the fact that any and all of that wealth is intrinsically and inherently linked to connections to the CCP itself. Same can be said for Russia. I have no doubt that there are any number of comparable examples on the African continent as well that aren't necessarily of the magnitude, but are similar typology. But I think this gets to the issue at play again, which I mentioned earlier, that so many of these regimes, again, as we all know here, resemble one another in increasing elements. That is to say, those authoritarian figures, those authoritarian regimes increasingly mirroring one another, using the same networks at the end of the day.
Yeah, consolidated dictatorship all over the world is the same.
Yeah.
It relies on access to the West. Something I'm very fond of saying is modern dictatorship relies on access to the West. It relies on the network structures, and they rule through corruption. Now, China, of course, by a magnitude, but then Russia by a percentage. I mean, the Russian oligarchs have stolen, the Putin regime has stolen such a vast percentage. Something our friend Oliver Bluo, another journalist on this, has said before, there are no millionaires in Russia. There's only billionaires and everybody else.
So let's focus on Russia for a second. It was, I've received a message. We had wanted to have someone join us on this panel who's been very interested in focusing on Russian corruption. And this person is Bill Browder. And Bill was very kind enough to record a message for us, which has arrived after we've started this. So this is why I've been texting. I haven't been tweeting. I've literally been talking to my colleagues. So I think we're gonna play a little message from Bill, who could not join us because he is at one of the gatherings of the world's most corrupt people in Switzerland. It's something called Davos. So Bill is at Davos talking to the corrupt people. So I think we should go ahead and play this. You can lower the lights if you wish, and hopefully our heads won't be in the way of this message.
Welcome to this afternoon's session, Corruption, Rent-Seeking, and the Acquisition of Loot, the central objectives of authoritarianism. Over 22 years, Vladimir Putin and the 1,000 people around him have stolen from the Russian state $1 trillion. That's the money that should have been spent on hospitals, schools. Instead, the money was spent on private planes, yachts, villas, and Vladimir Putin was deeply worried that the Russian people would rise up. And that wasn't an unrealistic worry. The same thing happened very recently in Kazakhstan, where a dictator, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who had been around much longer than Putin, finally had his day when the people rose up and cleared him and his family out. Putin saw the writing on the wall. He launched a war as a distraction. So people wouldn't be mad at him, they'd be mad at a foreign enemy. And so oftentimes in the West, people say, well, that country is corrupt, but so what? Well, the so what is that corruption leads to war leads to death, and that leads to escalation. It's not just Russia that does this. Every kleptocracy in the world is unsustainable. Every kleptocracy in the world then leads to violence inside the country and violence outside the country. There probably is no more important issue than this, and the people here who are presenting are some of the best experts in the world. Paul Massaro from the Helsinki Commission has been involved in some of the most groundbreaking legislation. Michael Casey from the Hudson Institute Kleptocracy Initiative is an author, commentator, and brain trust on this issue. And Joyce Ututu, a BBC reporter who's seen all this firsthand. And of course, this session is moderated by none other than Thor Halverson, who knows all too well, having seen so many different cases, how this issue plays out in different countries.
So, well, thank you, Bill, for that. I think I wanted to what makes this session so much more interesting is, I think, the amount of color that it can bring. You know, my personal favorite, in terms of favorite, I don't mean that in a positive sense, is the dictator of a former Spanish colony in Spain, in Africa, called Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea is a tiny little country that has the GDP per capita of Germany, yet most of you have probably never heard of it, or didn't know that it had the GDP per capita of Germany. Yet most people live on less than a handful of dollars per day, because the government has been controlled by the same family since the 1960s. And the son of the president, who, by the way, is at this point the longest-serving dictator alive today, is Teodoro Obiang. And his son, Teodoro Jr., Teodorin, bought a multi-million-dollar house in Malibu, California, where he had several Bentleys, different colors, and he would wear different suede shoes to match the color Bentley he was using. And once he was picked up by someone else, and the driver came to pick him up in his car, and he said, "That's the wrong car, they don't match my shoes, go home, change the car, and bring it back." Meanwhile, of course, you should see how people live in Equatorial Guinea. It is fundamentally different to how this first family lives. This first family who visits Washington, D.C., and Condoleezza Rice gives him an award presented by a big foundation in Washington, D.C., and refers to him as "my dear friend." By the way, it's not just Condoleezza Rice. It doesn't matter who is in power. They're all dear and good friends because there are national security interests. But there's, at the same time, an immoral foreign policy going on. And Obiang was also the person who bought, for those of you who are old enough to remember, the famous Michael Jackson glove. Teodorin Obiang bought the Michael Jackson glove. He had a massive collection, and 18 different sports cars and luxury cars in Paris, where he had an Hotel de Ville that was worth, it was a 9-figure purchase. And this was ultimately seized. When it is exposed, it is seized. When the public gets angry in these countries and say what's going on, it is seized. Now, what do you three think we can do to address this? Or is our system so corrupt with lawyers and members of the US Congress and members of the German parliament, or members of the former chancellors of Germany who now sits on the board of Putin's gas company? What can be done? Because they seem to be everywhere. They're buying media, they're buying properties. The Saudis bought Live Nation. The Saudis invested in Netflix, massive investment with Netflix. Twitter is owned now in part by someone who is theoretically just a Saudi prince, but it's really just an extension of the government. So what is the solution here?
If I could just jump in really quickly with a couple of solutions there, Thor, I just wanted to highlight much of what was Obiang's assets in the U.S. were seized. Unfortunately, the crystal Michael Jackson glove was not. He smuggled it out of the country, and you have to now go to Equatorial Guinea if you want to see Michael Jackson's famous glove. I still haven't been.
Was it not in Paris?
He had other assets in Paris as well, some of which were seized and some of which he was also able to smuggle out. But no, the short answer is transparency. The short answer is we need transparency for corporate formation, we need transparency in real estate purchases, we need transparency in high-end, high-class, high-value asset purchases and investments. And certainly in the U.S.'s case, we have seen significant improvement, significant momentum in this space moving forward. And I did want to just answer briefly because Paul is the actual go-to expert on this in terms of policy responses. So Paul, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to think about this in two sort of camps. One is laws and one is norms. And in the norms camp, it's important to understand that for the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, we have been in this ideological framework of what the Germans call Wandel durch Handel, or change through trade, or economic integration über alles, or end of history, or whatever one might call it. But the notion of this was if we economically integrate, norms will follow. We'll economically integrate the whole world, financially, and through trade and whatever else, and then we'll have democratic spillover. The opposite has happened. We've seen consolidated dictatorships spring up through corruption, and in fact, this has cured I think what Thor was pointing out earlier about the Soviets, the fundamental problem with closed dictatorship, that is the elites can't have what the democratic elites have. Now, the elites in these dictatorships can live abroad, spend money abroad, steal from their country, and in fact spread their illicit wealth throughout our societies. So because of this, something I've worked on for the last 10 years in DC, is framing this as a national security threat. So Thor, you'd said there's national security interests with Equatorial Guinea. I mean, I would say the greatest national security interest of the United States is countering corruption. And we've finally gotten there. I'm very glad to say, but this has been the last year. We've been working on this for a really long time, and when I started working on this in 2013, I'd walk into a room with national security experts, and I'd say corruption is a national security threat, and they'd laugh me out of the room, you know? They'd say, well, what about terrorism? What about kinetic warfare? What about nuclear? And all those things are still national security threats. But the fact is, corruption is there. It was undermining our democracy from within. And now, finally, thanks to great bipartisan efforts in 2020 to abolish anonymous shell companies, followed up with the formation of the Caucus Against Foreign Corruption and Kleptocracy, followed by the President Biden, actually in 2021, declaring corruption a core national security interest of the United States, followed by the first ever U.S. strategy against countering corruption. We're finally getting there. And this has all been deeply expedited by the fact that norms just flew forward after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, even individuals like Gerhard Schroeder, no love lost between me and former Chancellor Schroeder, who has now actually stepped down, resigned from his position at Rosneft. That doesn't, he's under intense pressure. Francois Fillon, former Prime Minister of France, has also resigned from his position on a Russian state-owned company. And Karen Kneißl, former foreign minister, Austrian foreign minister, who danced with Putin at her wedding, famously, has now also resigned. So the normative capacity here is really, really, really important, and it drives the laws forward. So you need both. You can't just get transparency. You also need a world in which it's just completely unacceptable to accept dictator money.
I was going to say, Paul, danced with Putin might be one of the most cursed phrases I've ever heard in English before.
Well, Sharon Stone did sing along with him at some point. But no, let's actually focus on something that Paul said. So Paul said they want to visit the West. Now, Bill Browder's answer to this is eliminate the visas. In Venezuela, the country where I was born, which is, I think, definitely up in the top 3 in terms of the sheer amount, trillions, sheer amount that has been stolen, and HSBC noted that it was like the Venezuelan accounts were some of the largest one when they did the HSBC leak. If you eliminate the visas from these people, and their kids can't get to go to Disney World, and their wives can't get to visit the democracies, and they're going to have to go shopping in Moscow, they're going to have to go to visit Pyongyang, they're going to have to go on holiday to Iran, and that's not necessarily where they want to be. They're willing to withstand being there, but really they want to live the lives of Westerners in the West, send their children to Western universities,
yes,
have houses, whether it's in Paris or in Belgravia, England, in London, or in the Hamptons, and they wish to take their private planes there. And so eliminating visas is one relatively easy solution, and ensuring that it's not just the principals, it's their children. It's their children. It's the entire family. And it's not a question of, oh, well, that's unfair. What have they done? This is not a trial. It's not an issue of due process. A visa is a privilege.
Yeah.
So do you think this would impact people in Africa, Joyce?
Yeah, and I think I also just want to go back to the example that you gave of Equatorial Guinea, because there are so many similarities with that country and the DRC, for example. Like the Congo is home to a range of vast, minerals. It's a very minerally rich country. The coltan that we use in our phones, in our iPads, in our laptops, all originate from this one country. Yet the vast majority of the population of 90 million people live on less than $2 million a day, and that's very much, $2 a day, not $2 million.
$2 million.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, right. With less than $2 a day, and that's very much because the wealth is very much circulated within the same elite. And I think when we talk about corruption and we talk about the impact of it, I think for places, many parts of Africa, when you know, people's main thought is, how am I going to feed my children? They don't really have time to think, oh, our government is corrupt and therefore we need to protest and we need to call for change. That is not their natural rationale. Their natural rationale is, how am I going to eat today? How am I going to send my children to school? And so on and so forth. So I think for me, it's really one way to essentially create a change is really, you know, giving people access to that information. So how do you make corruption relatable? How do you explain to the average person, this person taking 1 million of public funds, that means you don't have access to healthcare. That means you don't have access to roads. It's really that.
The answer is public exposure.
Right.
Which is why dictatorships are so interested in ensuring that they control Twitter and that the bots exist. Because then anyone who's pointing this out gets 5,000 people voting down the tweet, reporting the tweet as harassment, reporting it as abuse. Twitter's algorithm decides, oh, wow, all this is happening, this must be wrong, and Twitter's algorithm eliminates the tweet or hides it, and nobody can see it, and it's just done automatically. But they're one step ahead of the West. And Twitter was not set up to be something to expose public corruption. We want it to be that. It was not set up to be an app to help human rights defenders. It was set up a place where people can share stuff in democracies. That's what it was originally set up as, and to, you know, share a few photos and opinions. So what you're saying is exposing it. Now, exposing it carries tremendous risk to those doing it. Tremendous risk. It's no question that if we inform populations, and this is precisely the reason why Navalny is in prison. Navalny is in prison because he made a film about Putin's castle, Putin's billion-dollar home, and exposed the corruption over and over and over again of so many different oligarchs, so many figures in their government. That's why he's in prison. And in doing so, by the way, also became the champion of the people. Most people don't realize that Hugo Chavez in Venezuela did not run for election saying, I'm going to ruin the economy, go to war with all democracies, support the Iranians, ally myself with Putin, destroy the oil company, and steal all the money. That is not how he ran for office. His campaign focused on one thing and one thing only. We are going to fight corruption. And Venezuela had your, typical Latin American 4% of the public budget ended up, going on in commissions and kickbacks and whatnot. And that was an outrage. And people were so sick of that 4%. They were so disgusted with that 4%. What they didn't realize is that this populist, this extremely corrupt man who was essentially an agent of the Cuban government, took over, and it wasn't 4%. It became 99.4%. It's very, very tragic because corruption is an issue that populists can use. So you also have to make sure Kabila came to power as the liberator of the people. He came to power after Sisek was the liberator of the people. Once he was in power, he went right to the same place. Fidel Castro came to power as the liberator of the people and ended up living in the home of the richest person in Cuba. You will find very few books and photos that contain the crimes of Fidel Castro that are economic crimes. A former bodyguard of his took photographs with him of Fidel on his yacht, Fidel fishing, Fidel doing this. Same with Arafat. Used to sleep in a little tent and show everyone, do you want to see the little tent that I sleep in? Because he didn't want to show people the bank accounts that his wife had in France or in Switzerland. It's like some of them are smarter at hiding it. Others are just blatant. So visas, let's stick to visas.
So on visas, great idea, absolutely. Sanctions, absolutely. Block them from our shores and financial system, terrific. We can go even further than that. We should be blocking the visas of their enablers. One of our top guys, co-chairman of the Helsinki Commission, Representative Steve Cohen, recently wrote a letter to the Secretary of State requesting this. He said, here are the top 6 guys who are lawyers in the UK who are taking oligarch money to harass journalists and dissidents through the UK libel tourism system. These people should not be allowed to travel to the United States. We need to be thinking like this, because at the end of the day, you're totally right, Thor, but none of these dictators do it alone. Every single one of them relies on Western accountants, Western bankers, Western lawyers, so on and so forth. And we need to make those people, those enablers, who are under our jurisdiction. They're under our jurisdiction. Yep. They're in our systems.
But some of these enablers are not foreign citizens from Britain who should not be given a visa to the United States. Some of them are Americans. Some of them are former Congress people.
So this is where I get to...
Some of them are in our midst. You have the Atlantic Council receiving money from dictatorships and giving an award to the dictatorship of Gabon. And the week that this happened, the Human Rights Foundation informed the Atlantic Council that this was not acceptable, and they very quickly eliminated the award, embarrassing the dictator of Gabon, who inherited the position, President Ali Bongo. And then they called us and said, we're on the same side on Russia. Why can't you just let us do this? And it's like, no, this is not acceptable. This is an outrage, and you guys are we're not saying we're holier than thou, but well, A, no dictatorship has really offered us money, and B, if they did, it would have to be such a vast amount of money for us to be corrupted. That was a joke, by the way. That was a joke. But it's just like,
too real.
Make sure you note that.
I'm saying, like, if you want to buy us, I mean, it's $500 billion. Okay, we're going to stop operation.
It's really
and then
funny.
we can start a new one with that $500 billion.
You know what's really funny about that, though? Just how cheaply we in the West sell
Unbelievably
ourselves.
cheap.
I mean, it's
unbelievably
Gerhard
cheap.
Schroeder's like $500,000 a year.
Unbelievably
He's a former German chancellor. I mean, it's unbelievably cheap.
There are Venezuelans and Guatemalans in this crowd. They will tell you a bribe paid to a government minister in a South American country is going to be $20, $50 million, $100 million. You want to buy a former congressman of the United States? It's a $20,000 a month retainer for 1 year. And that's it. And you're like, that's all? There was a really, really evil Venezuelan businessman by the name of Gustavo Cisneros. And Cisneros had on his payroll Henry Kissinger. And for a very small amount of money, he could show off all of this. And he could continue. I mean, a man responsible for so many of the problems in our country and had a parallel system to pay members of Congress of the Venezuelan government off. And it's like, this problem is endemic. It's everywhere. Visas is one way.
It's a big one.
Now, stopping the enablers in the West starts with exposing them, showing who they are. How do we do that effectively? It's not a little article. It's not a tweet. How do we do that effectively?
Well, we turn to the investigative journalists that are the ones on the ground digging into these networks. We turn to those international, transnational, collaborative outfits, those like OCCRP, those like the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, those like remarkably talented journalists like Joyce today, who might be able to tell us a little bit more about what investigative journalists do, can do, should do, need help doing.
Yeah, I mean, with us, it's not even the journalists. I think it's the incredibly brave whistleblowers who say, I've been working in this organization, I know the names, here is a document with everybody listed on it. And then I guess from there, it's really our job to go through almost every single piece of evidence that we've been given. So the Kabila investigation, for example, we had 3 million pieces of evidence to kind of sift through. And it was really that collaborative effort. And as I say there, it's just about, once you've been given that evidence, once you've been given those names, it's how do we stand this up, number one, in a way that we're not going to get sued? And also, how do we just relay it in the way and expose it, as Thor was saying, expose it in a way that people are really going to be outraged and are going to want to do something about it. And also send it to people like you guys, because once we've done that work, what do you then do with it?
Yeah, so what do we do with it? So I work on the legislative side, my colleagues in the executive branch work on the law enforcement side, and I can say no law enforcement investigation begins or succeeds without whistleblowers and journalists. It's all based on press accounts. Every law enforcement investigation begins on press accounts or because a whistleblower comes forward. So that said, our system is so opaque, so much finance, so many opportunities to work for bad guys are anonymous. You can avoid a lot of the systems we have in place. So what we need to do is clean up our act at home. And we've started that in 2020 by beginning the process of abolishing anonymous shell companies. Now, these are still not abolished. we're still waiting on a long implementation of the rule. We're currently fighting in Congress to pass legislation that would create basic due diligence requirements for gatekeeper professions. That is, right now in the USA, the only financial gatekeeper that needs to ask any questions about origin of funds are banks. Lawyers don't need to ask questions. Accountants don't need to ask questions. Real estate professionals don't need to ask questions.
House managers,
auction trust and company formation agents. Nobody. You can just take money. Just take it. You don't need to ask any questions. So that's one thing. You can create these tripwires to ask questions. Another huge thing is this authoritarian, what I call the authoritarian revolving door. Now, the revolving door is a problem, but the authoritarian revolving door is a national security threat. I mean, the idea that you could be a former government official and then go work for an authoritarian regime that is anathema to U.S. national security interests, I mean, it just blows my mind that that's allowed. I mean, it's borderline treacherous. It is treacherous. So, I mean, we really need to create a system that doesn't allow this at all. Now, we've begun that through Foreign Agents Registration Act. We have the Lobbying Disclosure Act. Now, the Lobbying Disclosure Act is supposed to be for those not working for foreign agents, but through the very clever way in which modern authoritarianism, modern dictatorship works, it's very easy to avoid our Foreign Agents Registration Act. So we need to update that. And then, I mean, overall, we need to build, and we're working on this, a presumption of blood money when it comes to dictatorships. If you are working for a dictatorship, you should not be allowed to accept compensation. We should just assume that any money coming out of Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, wherever, that this money was obtained illegally if it's the government or anyone attached to the government in any kind of beneficially owned way.
Yeah, and look, we're talking about an incredibly depressing topic today, right? This is not the most enjoyable one. There's, we're having some coffee to get us through this and try to find some laughs where we can. But there is reason for optimism, and it's beyond just silver linings. We have seen remarkable momentum in the U.S. alone, to say nothing of the broader West, the broader world, over just the past few years, through work of those like Paul, work of those like Joyce, work of other
work of those like Casey.
Sure, well, include me in there. I'm happy to be included. All of those that are working to push us. One of the primary reasons has only been in the last few years that we have seen such remarkable progress in this space, in this counter-kleptocracy, anti-corruption space, linking it to national security.
Well, and can I say, finish up, yeah.
Is
sorry.
because of things like the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, the Pandora Papers. Again, transnational, international journalistic organizations using whistleblowers, incredibly brave whistleblowers, who have come forward, releasing and revealing the details of how the modern offshoring economy works, how modern authoritarianism is intrinsically linked to the offshoring economy, and then beyond that, how especially Western jurisdictions profit from that.
But let me stop you right there. The reality is, privacy is not a bad thing, and it's not a sin. Many of the people who were exposed in the Panama Papers were people who were honest business people, who don't want the dictatorships where they live to know that they have money. That's not a bad thing. Hiding, privacy is something that exists. People should not have to know, how much money you earn, or if
you're right.
No, I'm saying authoritarians are linked to it, but that's part of it. That's part of it.
You're right, and I'll say these considerations come deeply into the debate. The U.S. Beneficial Ownership Registry is private, much to the chagrin of a lot of anti-corruption campaigners, for this very reason. In the British Beneficial Ownership Registry, you can request cutouts, you can request delisting and stuff like that so as to protect yourself. We are always thinking in terms of how do we ensure that privacy is respected, because you're exactly right.
If taking these networks down would have been easy, we would have done it years ago.
Look, I think. Let me tell you. Even though I'm moderating, I have a couple of ideas and a couple of really focused potential solutions to this problem. I think that the incentive structure is upside down, because the fact is that any billionaire, whether they are from Yemen, Venezuela, Saudi, is under investigation by the Department of Justice. Simple. He hires the former Attorney General. He hires the former Secretary of State. He donates a substantial amount of money to the Clinton Foundation. Used to be one way of getting it. Clinton Foundation, which as soon as she didn't win, all of all the donations dried up. They dried up for a reason. Yeah. There was no expectation of being able to buy access. But at the same token, at every level, the people in Miami want that Russian money, that Kazakh money, that dirty money coming from other countries. And they have no KYC. There's no know your customer when it comes to buying an apartment. You can just show up with any amount of money and no one questions where you got the money from when you buy real estate.
You're doing cash.
Because these people know it may be dirty, but we want it. Because if they buy this, they're going to pay property taxes. And if they pay property taxes, then the mayor is going to have a budget. So there's such a disincentive structure. My big idea is incentivize the struggle against corruption. Provide a 25% reward to the whistleblower.
Thor.
And then see how fast you're going to have everyone whistleblowing, everyone saying, I know where their money is. I know, secretaries, their personal trainer, their neighbors. Everyone's going to say, they're corrupt, they're so-and-so, he's a former minister of this, and here's their house. Or they can do it anonymously.
I've got some good news for you. We made this law already, and it's in place as of 2 months ago. So the kleptocracy Asset Recovery Rewards Program is available to anyone.
Is it federal?
It's federal.
Is there a limit to how much you can collect?
It is determined by the Attorney General. I think it's like 20 to 30%.
Because there used to be a ceiling of 500,000, which of course made it impossible to want to do it. But if there's no ceiling on this...
So this is brand new. This is part of the rollout of the National Defense Authorization Act 2020, which also was where the anonymous shell company legislation was passed. So anyone in this room that would like to become a kleptocracy bounty hunter, now is the time. If you have information,
good money.
There's a whole.
Well,
you can. The
the
Treasury's got a great.
The answer is
website on it.
incentivizing the struggle. Some people are not going to have. They may be afraid to do it, but there are a lot of people who won't be afraid to do it.
And please, if you do have information, let me know. Be happy to publish on. Let Joyce know as well.
Happy.
Yeah.
And I will give you a higher percentage than whatever they promised me. So come to me instead.
Don't come to me. No. I can't accept any of the money because it's in the line of duty. So.
Right. But maybe we could.
I think to your point, and you'll have further ideas. I just want to highlight one thing that you're talking about right now. This is an incredibly flexible, fluid time. Whatever month of May of 2022 right now. It is an incredibly fluid time in the broader anti-corruption, counter-kleptocracy space. There are more ideas, there are more policy platforms, there are more elements of ingenuity than we have ever seen before. And I know we have 10, 15 minutes left. Just as a quick call to action for those in the room, go up to American partners, go up to Western partners, go up to those destination countries where that money ends up in the real estate sector, in the private equity sector, in the art and auction sector, and tell them that's where the money's ending up. Tell them to support these ideas. Tell them to come up with their own ideas, because now is the time to strike when the iron is hot. Because of all of the leaks, all of the revelations, all of the realities we have seen from corruption internationally over the past few years, now is when there are those in Washington, in London, in Ottawa, in Canberra, and elsewhere that are listening, that want these ideas. So bring them to them. Doesn't matter what the limits may be. Bring them the ideas.
And because of Ukraine's bravery and courage.
Oh, absolutely.
That's really, I've seen the last few months so many ideas become policy just faster than ever. It felt like we worked for 10 years and then we got like X amount done, and then within the last few months we got the same amount done.
And let's be clear, the people who are supportive and enabling the Russian dictatorship have blood on their hands.
Yes.
And whether that enabling is by being their real estate agent or by servicing their yacht, it's that simple. If we can cancel people in democracies because of their views on gay marriage, how is it possible that at the same time we are unwilling and unable to say no? How is it possible that entire state governments in the United States will say, no one from our state government can travel to, say, the state of Georgia because of past potential legislation on gay marriage, but they were perfectly okay with investing their money into Russian funds that had all sorts of things involving gas and oil, and it's really just such rank hypocrisy, and it's not brought to their attention because they're all doing it. So what we need is one to break away and maybe show the path.
Yeah, and it's missed opportunities, and it's a potential platform for us, for other politicians, other outlets elsewhere to build upon, which is why we're talking about this today. Joyce, I wanted to ask you a question because you have really dug into granular elements of some of these networks we're talking about. For instance, former President Kabila's network and his assets elsewhere. Are there specific policy outcomes on your end that you think could have either prevented or shed more light on where that money had gone? For instance, his yacht, you were never quite able to connect. I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to disclose about that.
Yeah, so I mean, we kind of looked into where the assets were and what we were able to directly link him to, but it's extremely difficult because of the networks and because of the people that essentially surround and in some way almost shield the true identity of the people who are spending the money. So, yeah, there was just so many that we weren't able to, prove, even though, even if something is, knowledge. Like, if you're unable to kind of prove that, it's very hard to kind of say. But I think just to follow off the back of your call to action, I think if there's anyone here who has a story, who has a lead, and there's a journalist that, whose investigative skills that you're a fan of or that you like, feel free to always DM journalists, email them, because you never know, something which you may think is really small may end up being like blowing the lid off something huge.
Journalists receive a lot of derogatory tweets and social media messages throughout the day. They don't hear quite as much from their fans, and they love hearing from fans.
Thank a journalist.
Nothing worse than a journalist who sells out to a dictatorship, and there are many.
Sure.
And there are again, this affects everything.
Yeah.
So the key is transparency, public exposure, and creating an incentive structure.
Yeah.
But that, I think, do we have consensus on this? Yeah.
No, it is,
And I was going to say to that point, Thor, making sure that these elements, these policies, these decisions remain. Paul, talk to Paul more if you want further details about actual policy responses. But there's a second half or another component of that, and that is enforcement. It's funding for these new policies, these new databases, these new disclosure requirements, and actually enforcing, making sure those that violate these procedures, these new policies, go to jail or pay a fine, what have you. It's similar to sanctions policies, for that matter. You have sanctions policies implemented for a reason, and we know sanctions have been incredibly effective anti-corruption, counter-kleptocracy tools, because these are networks at the end of the day, and they're disrupting networks. And if you're potentially lifting these sanctions without any kind of reason or rationale for that, it lessens the efficacy of those sanctions all around. I mean, similar to what's potentially happening in Venezuela moving forward.
So now I think we should let someone in the audience maybe have a chance to put maybe a different opinion or a question. You can raise your hands, and our trusted colleague here will bring you the microphone. It's a long walk because it's a big theater. Maybe we're better to have a panel in a place like this because it's such a big topic,
Oh, yeah.
Big topic, big
Fills the whole
auditorium.
room. You can see it up there,
Corruption's all around us.
Hi. Thank you for this interesting topic. The only comment that I have is that we have on the stage 3 white male talking for 90%, 95% of the time. This is unacceptable, and this is really shameful, guys.
Sorry, did you guys hear that?
Any other questions, comments?
Right here, Fadi, in the first row.
Hi, thank you. My name is Fadi Al-Salamin, and I focus on anti-corruption within the Palestinian territories. One common thread that I've noticed, whether it's in Afghanistan, Iraq, and even the Palestinian Authority, is that most of the funds stolen come from Western donors. Yet at the same time, up to the last minute, whether you look at Afghanistan or Iraq, and I think even the Palestinian Authority, these are corrupt figures who are viewed as almost celebrities. They're dealt with, they're received, they're funded. They're seen as the solution as opposed to the nightmare that could exist if not dealing with them. And that is in itself is a false reality. So how do we prevent this from happening or continuously happening in other places? And then when you look at a place like the Palestinian Authority, and I know Thor mentioned earlier one of the leaders, but now the current one is, you talked about CCP being the club of billionaires. Fatah today is the club of millionaires. The president himself is very wealthy. And how do you convince even the State Department to look at him and not giving him a visa or any of his entourage? So, it's more than just, corrupt officials stealing money. They do have enablers. And I don't want to talk generally, but how do you also get the different government agencies talking to each other so that they agree on the same
I think it's a very, very important thing to note, and a lot of people are nervous precisely about giving Ukraine $40 billion and just saying here, and not having controls over it, because we could end up in a situation, let alone reconstruction, assuming everything goes the way it should, reconstruction in the future, turning Ukraine into another Afghanistan. And I think part of the reason why in the West these certain people were celebrated is because it's much easier for a Western leader to think, oh, there's one guy, he's going to fix it all. Let's put all of our hope in this one guy. In that case, it was Karzai. And instead of realizing this is a mess, we're just going to have to deal with this. It's going to be a lot of work. We need to ensure that there's checks and balances and so on and so forth. I think the fundamental problem that the West has had with an understanding of shifting from dictatorship to democracy is that it is not about giving elections to a country that has been a dictatorship for the longest time. You have a population that lacks critical thinking, that has been reprogrammed to think a certain way, to act a certain way, is angry, is ripe for populism, which is exactly what happened in Egypt post-Mubarak. The answer is setting up a constitutional system with checks and balances, with setting up an actual republic that can function, and ensure that power is divided against itself, and that you have lots of people watching each other so that when the money comes in, I mean, one answer, of course, is some people say blockchain can be involved in this. I mean, I don't know why we cannot do what was done in the state of Ohio by a man who was treasurer of the state of Ohio, and he started a program called Open the Books, openthebooks.com. Every single expenditure at every level of the Ohio government, you could go online and find it. How much has been spent on teachers, not just in general, down to every school. How much has the governor spent on car services? How much has the governor spent on food? It's like every single component, and that is the way it should be. I also think, frankly, Norway, I think, goes too far on transparency. They publish everyone's taxes in this country. Every single individual, you can find out how much they made last year, what their assets are, and what they paid in taxes. I think we should demand that of everyone who works in government. So if you work in government, it's not just a sworn declaration, it's all of your tax returns are available, and we know everything, so that if there's a massive jump somehow, this needs to be explained. I think public service should go along with that. So, I mean, I don't know how you react to Fadi's excellent question.
Yeah, it is an excellent question, and I hate to say about the reason we can't do what they did in Ohio is because we don't want to. I mean, a lot of this security assistance, I mean, it's been there for a long time, and it's a legacy in the Cold War. Its precise purpose is to keep dictators on the side of the United States in most cases. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's a different way of approaching international relations, a way that I don't believe in or endorse, but it's a very popular way, you know. And it's you'll find many people that say, you know, the U.S. needs to think about its core national security interests, which means, you know, maintaining these ties to dictators. I think this always blows up in our face. I think the best thing we can do is stick to our values, do values-based foreign policy, and think about anti-corruption, and that's going to long-term always be better for us, always. But, you know, you're debating against the entire Pentagon in a lot of cases.
Well, one side wants to threaten you with death. You know, typically that was the Cold War, was one side would threaten you with death, do what we say or else, and the other side would say, we'll give you tons of money. And unfortunately, so much of this is a legacy of this. So we're now being told on this screen that we are over time by 25 seconds. So I think, should we wrap this up with like a 20-second outro?
Well, try to keep it to 20 seconds. I mean, I just want to reiterate what I mentioned earlier. Now is the time to talk to any potential Western interlocutors or partners you may converse with, because the fluidity, the openness, the realization that these destination countries, especially the US, Canada, the UK, the EU, realizing what a national security threat this is for them beyond any kind of moral consideration at the end of the day, just highlight that time and time and time again.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, just if there's a journalist whose work that you really appreciate, always reach out to them. And I just want to say, you know, just a huge, I really kind of want to applaud the journalists who do this kind of work, especially the journalists who live under dictatorships in developing countries where they do have that risk of being imprisoned or tortured or even killed for talking about topics like this. So I think it's really important to continue to talk about it. From my side, we'll continue to investigate this kind of thing, and hopefully we will make some, you know, measurable changes.
Yeah, I guess, you know, I viewed this for a long time as the generational struggle, as anti-corruption being, you know, the biggest thing we can do. Democracy fundamentally is about accountability. That's where it comes from, is accountable elections. You know, I mean, this is why it's different than dictatorship, is because it's accountable. So whatever you really passionately care about, climate change or human trafficking or dictatorship, whatever it is, I mean, it all links back to this fight against corruption. Global corruption is the problem we face today. It is the dark side of globalization. It is what is undermining everything foundationally.
That is a really wonderful way of wrapping up. And it's basically, like you said, the other side of dictatorship is corruption. The other side of every single human rights violation, every person who's beaten up, is because they are a threat to their control of the loot. What's been very interesting, I've noticed, is the two anti-corruption campaigners are dressed like bankers. They're dressed like suits.
It's a flamingo tie.
Yes, yeah, very, very, very Miami. So please, a round of applause for our excellent, excellent panelists. They will be available for questions. We're going to, I think, have a break now, and then there's all sorts of other interactive sessions. By the way, if you don't know what's on your schedule, you can always click on the back of your badge, and you take a photograph of this, and it will give you your schedule as well. So thank you very much. And remember, if you have any ideas or you want to blow the whistle, I will pay more percentage than Casey will share with you.
I don't make a lot of money.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
That was excellent.
Thanks, Thor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
hot nights coming. Keep the car running. On the fingers, swallow my pollen. Gold, I fell into your spell. On the ride of God with fair. You were plush and I lay bare. You had me howling. Cold, I fell into your skin. On the night you let me under your sin. You had me howling. You had me howling.
Bitcoin is worthless artificial gold.
I think I should say modestly that I think the whole damn development is disgusting and contrary to the interests of civilization.
This is just a beanie baby that runs on coal.
You know, I agree. I would short it if there was an easy way to do it.
These men all share one thing in common. They are all citizens of advanced economies with property rights, free speech, a functioning legal system, and stable reserve currencies. Only 13% of our planet's population is born into this.
Is there any chance for a deal in these talks today between Russia and Ukraine?
The other 87% are born in a country with a weak currency or authoritarian regime. These critics are missing the big picture. Anyone with access to the internet can participate in Bitcoin. It runs on a network that does not discriminate. While Western headlines focus on Coinbase going public and tech bros getting fabulously rich,
more than double the company's valuation, with
there is a revolution happening worldwide. For Gates, Munger, and Buffett, Bitcoin is rat poison squared.
The price sits above 50,000 now. Where do you think it's going?
But for Ire from Nigeria, Mo from Sudan, and Carl from Ethiopia, Bitcoin is much more.
I'm hopeful for Nigeria's future. I've seen Bitcoin's potential firsthand. Bitcoin allowed us to fight SARS, a notorious unit of the Nigerian police with a long record of abuses. In October 2020, I joined the Feminist Coalition, which began accepting donations via Flutterwave, a fintech product. This started off well enough, but then the regime started cracking down. Our bank accounts were shuttered. Bitcoin was the only option left. There was no other way to receive, store, and spend money. This was an eye-opening moment. We ended up setting up a BTC Pay server to process donations from around the world.
But Ire isn't the only one with hope for the future. For Kalkasa in Ethiopia, Bitcoin is about bridging the gap between the upper and lower classes in a corrupt system.
Wages do grow, but not on par with inflation. Salaries in urban areas have perhaps doubled over the past decade, but goods have gone up by 3 to 5 times. The upper classes use the dollar as their unit of account, but the poor outside the city, well, dollars are officially illegal for them.
Kasa's brother was arrested for simply having a $20 bill in his pocket, but the arrest wasn't enough to stop Carl.
I created a Telegram group where I pay freelancers, graphic designers, and translators based in Ethiopia with Bitcoin. In America, most people treat Bitcoin as an investment or as a savings account, but here I'm using it as a medium of exchange. It's part of my life.
Under the gold standard, Sudan was a stable economy. 3 Sudanese pound once bought you $1. There was a successful middle class in Khartoum. But what happened after that in the 1960s and the 70s, and continue to happen until today, is that the central bank is taking over and devaluing the currency. Today the inflation is more than 400%. The average citizen is watching their wages stagnate and the cost of living is rising. While Omar al-Bashir and his cronies managed to accumulate massive wealth in form of real estate and bank accounts in foreign banks.
What Mo describes is the Cantillon effect, a systemic plague wherein those closest to the source of the inflation profit, while the rest suffer.
Many Sudanese people are starting to use Bitcoin as a tool to escape corruption and as a lifeboat to survive this economic crisis.
Now, that is not something I think the world needs.
There is something inherently not credible about creating hundreds of billions in virtual wealth with nothing ever actually being accomplished.
Bill Gates.
Charlie Munger.
Warren Buffett. They don't like the technology behind Bitcoin because it's coming to seize a place in the global stage that they used to have just for themselves. Liberation technologies should be invested in, not shorted. And for those comfortable in the dollar bubble, it's time to check your financial privilege.
Hello, everyone. It's a very humbling experience to be here at the Oslo Freedom Forum, something I've personally been involved with for 14 years now, and something that we decided to add a little bit more context on for you this year is basically the worldwide quest for financial freedom that people have. In Norway, in the United States, in Europe, I think that we take a lot of things for granted. We take for granted our currency being stable. We take for granted having easy access to credit, having easy access to a banking system that actually works, being able to send money to our family and friends, not having our bank account frozen if the government doesn't like us, not facing things like hyperinflation. Unfortunately, for context, as the video described, that's the daily reality for about 87% of the world's population. They are either dealing with an authoritarian regime where there's no FDIC insurance, and there's certainly no one that's going to protect them in the court of law if the state decides to seize their stuff, or they're dealing with a weak currency that especially right now, is inflating rapidly. And there are a lot of societies around the world right now that are running out of dollars, which are really the real money in the financial system, and the local currencies are collapsing. I'm sure you've seen the news about Sri Lanka and many other places. Today, I'm really honored to be joined by 3 special guests to help tell you the story of why money is connected to human rights. So we're going to start by asking them a little bit about what money is like in their country, where they come from, how it differs from where money in our societies, let's say, and then how they've turned to Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies as an alternative. So we'll start with you, Mauricio. You have a pretty moving story about how you got out of repression and economic crisis in Venezuela. Why don't you start talking to us about your country and what happened to the money in your country over the last 15 years?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And first off, it's an immense privilege to be here. As a Venezuelan, I've seen others around and many others that don't get the chance to come here and share the stories. So I hope to be able to kind of relay some of what we've been through to this group. And you mentioned money collapsing. And to a lot of people, that's this abstract idea that, what does that feel like? What does that look like? Who does that impact? And going back to Venezuela, so just to give people context, in my lifetime, the Venezuelan government has wiped out 14 zeros from the currency.
14 zeros.
14 zeros. That is the number of zeros in a trillion. And so 1 bolivar today is a trillion bolivares 20 years ago. And that's how much it has inflated.
What has that done to the average person? Like, what is it? Like, that's an incredible mathematical concept, but can you translate that to us in terms of what is that mechanically doing to the society?
So what that does is, as money inflates, right, and basically you need more and more cash to do the exact same transaction, a couple of weird things start happening. So one, Venezuela is very much a cash society. A lot of places, especially in small towns, do not even have the means to accept a debit card. So most transactions have to be carried out in cash. Cash that is not available. Because when it hyperinflates, when you were buying this glass of water with a $1 bolivar, now it's costing you 500 bolivares, and you have to find the number of bills needed to buy this thing. And so everybody starts hoarding cash for the smallest things. Your ATM withdrawal limit goes from $100 to $1, and so you find yourself withdrawing 5 times to buy a can of Coke or to buy whatever. And the people in these remote villages, they don't even have the means to sell. Or they cannot because they cannot take digital payments.
They only have paper money.
Correct.
And the pricing is literally something that changes every day, or even every hour at times at peak hyperinflation. And this is just an immense suffering for the lower and middle classes. I mean, the wealthy during hyperinflation can borrow. They can borrow bolivars from the government and then buy a condo in Miami and then pay back the loan that was worth nothing. I mean, they have those sort of means, as do the 1% everywhere in the world. It's everybody else that sort of gets screwed in this scenario, right? And I mean, you were talking to me about how people would literally have to accumulate gigantic stacks of paper money just to buy things. Like, we've seen in history books what happened in Germany, obviously, in the 1920s under the Weimar government, but this is something you lived through.
Yeah, but the bills, and I don't know if anyone here saw them, but there was a point where bills became so worthless that people started making arts and craft with it to sell, and you would sell it as basically as takeaways, gifts, like a joke, kind of what it once was.
So money died in Venezuela. The local fiat currency died. Today, the country is sort of dollarizing.
So right now, what people do is the country went through this sort of de facto dollarization, and it was something that even though the dollar was outlawed, the bolivar was so broken that people kept trying to find a way to use the dollar, and the government didn't have really the means to enforce them not using so. And in order to open up the economy a little bit and bring down some of the protests and heat, he allowed dollarization. It stopped being illegal to hold dollars.
It's sort of an organic phenomenon, like it happened in Cuba in the 90s. And we'll come back and we'll talk to you about how you got out of the situation and what you're doing now with your company. But I want to go to Roya. Roya, why don't you introduce yourself briefly and tell us about what it's like to deal with money as a woman entrepreneur in Afghanistan.
Sure. Thank you very much, first of all, for giving me the opportunity to be here. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Roya Mahbub, and I'm running a non-profit organization called the Shelton Fund in Afghanistan to empowering the young women through giving them access to technology and education. For those who are growing up with the freedom and opportunity, it may be difficult to imagine how the other world look like. And when the education is afforded for everyone who desire it, oppression may seem far away. The technology that surrounded us every day, and we take it for granted, we don't know how lucky we are. But I grew up in a society that access to education and opportunity was limited and restricted for women. And many of the women in our country, my country and conservative countries, they do not have, or they have very little freedom to create lives for themselves. Their lives is actually run by men. Their finances controlled by men. And
They don't have the same financial rights as men.
no, they don't have.
And there might be laws, or there just might be social norms, not just in Afghanistan, but in other countries in the region, with regard to what you are and aren't allowed to do. And that impacts the society in a huge way, because it means women can't contribute to the economy in the same way, right?
Yes, unfortunately, right now, Afghanistan also, with the new governments, probably created more rules that, which is already created rules that women's activities in a society to be, disappear. Obviously, when you're living in a country that the restriction on the women's daily lives will be restricted, and women do not have a proper access to proper education, women's systematic operations will never be disappear.
So it's not like you could just, and especially now as the Taliban have taken power again, and girls can't even go to school anymore. The girls haven't been to school since the fall of Kabul last summer. It's not like you can just walk into a bank and open a savings account. Like if you're earning money through your time and labor as a woman in your country, saving that is extremely difficult. The best you can probably do is cash, which is very unstable right now, because the economy of that country is very unstable, because there's the Taliban are in power, and the US government actually seized the reserves of the entire country. So the economy is flailing, and there's shortages, and cash is not a great option. I want to get into the details of the amazing work you've done to educate women about financial empowerment. But first, we're gonna go over to Abu Bakr. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about the quality of the money in Nigeria, and what it's like to deal with the international financial system as a young Nigerian.
Yeah, sure. I'll definitely like to say a huge thank you to everyone that's here. It's a huge honor and privilege to be part of the Oslo Freedom Forum, especially talking about something as really sad and devastating as the financial state in Nigeria. Like you said, the quality of money in Nigeria, I would say the lack of the quality of the money that we have in Nigeria. So I'm Abubakar Nur Khalil. I'm a Bitcoiner. I'm a Bitcoin core contributor. I run a Bitcoin VC. I'm also a board member of the B Trust, and I run a program called Gala along with some other Bitcoiners. We're growing the number of Bitcoin and Lightning developers in Africa. Now, more with regards to the financial situation, it's dark. It is not a situation that I would wish on anyone around the world. So to put it in context, people like to say economics is a political argument. And it's not more, there isn't a place that's more true like Nigeria. So we're not only facing economic challenges, so we're talking about double-digit inflation for years now, more than 5 years since the current administration took over.
But Naira was once like the equivalent of the British pound.
Exactly.
Right? Now it's 400, 500.
It's insane.
Think about how crazy that is for a country of 200 million people, by the way.
100%. So back in 2015, it was around $100 per Naira, and then it now swiveled up all the way to now it's $630, really. But again, the CBN likes to pretend like they could just set this rate arbitrarily when there's literally a free market for you to do this, and it's crazy. So another thing is the food crisis. It's insane. So a lot of people, not only are they facing inflation, but driving higher prices on the food. So you have individuals who are earning in Naira and facing this inflation, and then now have to keep up with buying groceries. Regular things like, kerosene, because a lot of people use kerosene to actually cook, looking at rice, all that kind of stuff. Everything is now super priced, super heavy. So a lot of people are trying to move out into other currencies, like the dollar, for example. And it's common amongst currencies like the Naira, other currencies that are failing when it comes to inflation, moving to be dollarized. So what you tend to happen is them saving in the dollars, which isn't optimal really because of the restrictions on that.
So we can kind of see quite obviously through 3 countries in different parts of the world that the local currency is extremely poor, and people want dollars, but often dollars are very hard to get. Yeah. Dollars are very hard to get in all 3 countries. And in all 3 countries we've just described, you have to remember, it's not like you can just press a button on your phone and send $100 to somebody in one of these countries with the legacy financial system. There might be sanctions, there might be delays, there might be inspections, there might be red tape. Western Union, like a lot of these countries, have been restricted in a way that's very unfair. It's not like the average Venezuelan did anything wrong, right? So you have hundreds of millions of people worldwide that just don't have the same privileges we have. So each of you have turned to the new financial technology to help. So we'll go back to you, Mauricio, and just quickly give people an idea how you used Bitcoin to get out of Venezuela, start a new company, and then how you're now using Bitcoin to provide financial services to people across Latin America, including in Venezuela.
Yeah, thank you. This is my favorite part because it's about how things got better. So in the midst of the collapse of Venezuela, I had already made the decision to start working in Canada. So I was living in Canada when my youngest brother introduces me to the idea of mining Bitcoin in Venezuela. And the way it worked out, it was in the middle of at a time where nobody wanted to invest in Venezuela. Everybody was looking to leave the country because it was just a devastating, it was a horrible collapse. But my father and my brother and I, we thought it was a good idea. So he starts mining, and later that year, 6 months later, I went down for Christmas, and I went down to a country that was in a deep depression. All of my friends were liquidating their assets, getting ready to leave the country. But my brother was bucking the trend. He had a smile ear to ear. He was giddy. He was basically asking me if my friends had any extra sites or were leaving empty spots so we could get them. So he started mining and doing great. His friends started mining. My whole family starts mining. We start helping a lot of people mine to get the same benefit. And it went really well until the government caught on to how people were benefiting from Bitcoin. And at that point, the government essentially turned on the miners and started basically raiding our facilities, extorting all miners. And slowly but surely, you either became the government became your partner in the mine, or you kind of dropped it down.
So, as you told me, in an extremely vivid story that you all will have to hang out with Mauricio later and get the full picture. It's remarkable, but they ended up taking a lot of your mining infrastructure, but obviously they didn't take the Bitcoin, and you guys were able to make it to Canada. You've now started a company called Ledin, where he and his colleagues are able to actually allow people who have some Bitcoin to take out a loan on that Bitcoin as financial collateral in a way that is equal and fair for anyone from any country. So you were telling me you don't charge different rates or have different policies, whether you're in Mexico or the United States. This is a kind of unprecedented idea, and it's all made possible by this open, neutral, new kind of currency. So I think what you're doing is tremendous and really inspiring. Roya, also, you ended up turning to Bitcoin in 2013. You ended up paying, a lot of the people in your company, which was one of the first technology companies in Afghanistan led by women, with Bitcoin. You saw all the crazy ups and downs going from $100. That's when she first bought Bitcoin. It was at $100, by the way. $100 to $1,000, back down to $200, and now where it is today. But a lot of the people that you worked with, this was a massive benefit from them. And you continue to educate girls today secretly by video. And you continue to teach them about financial literacy in Bitcoin. So tell us about what this technology means to you and to the people that you're working with.
Of course, in 2013, when we got involved with the Bitcoin, we built a platform that allowed women to write blogs and sharing their creative contents by earning money. And it was very difficult at the beginning to pay because the number of the users growing, and many of these women didn't have bank account, they didn't have an ID and they didn't have the family's permissions to open a bank account, and finding PayPal was difficult. It was sanitation, so we couldn't use the PayPal, we couldn't use mobile money, and that's why we heard about Bitcoin. And from the moment that we heard it, we got excited about this digital coin that give you the financial freedom. And I think that Bitcoin for us is that it's a tool that allow us to bypass the physical and social barriers. And we are owner of our own money, and is not going to be stopped or censored by government, and also is not going to be affected by inflation when price of the monies of your country when the conflict is happening, and overnight your government is changed.
And it can't discriminate based on your gender.
Yes, it's
it
not
doesn't even know.
discriminate.
I think this is one of the most powerful things about this technology is it's open and neutral to anybody and is permissionless. You don't need ID to use it, and no one can stop you from using it, and no one can remotely confiscate it if you use it properly. And bravo to you for teaching so many women and girls about how to have financial freedom. Abu Bakr, we talk a lot about building financial bridges instead of walls. A lot of people, again, don't realize that the financial system for most people in the world is, again, not so easy. Everything is a gate, a wall, a barrier, a discrimination. So you're living that reality. You're cut off from the dollar system. you're living in much higher inflation than we enjoy, let's say, here in Norway, and you don't even get to make the rules about the money. The rules about the money are made up by an unelected group of people in the Federal Reserve Board, essentially, set the price of money for the whole world, right? So you're looking at this, and you're like, wait a second, we can build a new future for our country. So you have been tapped to lead the board of the B Trust, which you mentioned, which is an initiative by Jay-Z and Jack Dorsey to invest tens of millions of dollars into Bitcoin infrastructure in Nigeria and Africa and beyond. So talk to us a little bit about what your vision is. Like, where are we going in the future with this?
Yeah, so I think just to tie into the general conversation we're having, it's all about building the bridges that we're talking about. And the thing is, with Bitcoin, it already has a lot of these things solved really on day one. So you have an opt-in financial freedom tool, which is incredible for individuals that are under, intense governments who have, like, whether it's authoritarians or it's just in terms of currency controls that are harsh. So to give you an example in Nigeria, if you're trying to even dollarize and get a domiciliary account, what ends up happening is even via the app, you can actually send any money out, and as well as having limits on cards and stuff like that. So what happens is individuals now started flocking to Bitcoin because they realized that Bitcoin is the only way that they don't get discriminated on. They don't get any sort of restrictions that are necessary. So I think the future is definitely going to be Bitcoinized, really, as opposed to dollarized, where individuals are not only saving in Bitcoin, but they're also using Bitcoin for remittance as well as local trade. So that's definitely going to be...
And the vision that I think we all share is maybe a world where everybody shares the same money that's open and neutral, and that one country doesn't get special benefits over another due to its economic power or its military power, et cetera. And that we have a system that can be, non-discriminatory, which
Exactly.
we all, I think, would be a big upgrade. So next time someone tells you that Bitcoin's useless or doesn't have any value, you've now heard 3 very compelling stories from 3 very different parts of the world about why it provides tremendous value. And then maybe we have a conversation about its other costs and the mining and all these things, which we're going to talk about in the next few days. But those can be made in an adult conversation once you understand that this thing is valuable. So it's been a real privilege for me to allow them to share their stories with you. We look forward to hanging out with you later. And now we're going to have another session of people who are going to talk about how we can scale this thing to 1 billion people. I mean, you each have individually benefited from this thing, but Bitcoin is a technology that's growing, and it isn't quite where it needs to be, and it could reach 1 billion people, maybe. So we're going to hear from 4 very distinguished guests about that. Thank you all so much for joining. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
So we just heard that great panel about the various use cases of Bitcoin for all its humanitarian purposes. And in this panel, we're going to talk about some of the practical challenges and the practical opportunities that we have in terms of how to scale this and have it actually be able to reach 1 billion people. And what I'm excited about this panel is that all 3 of these people are builders. They're actively building things on Bitcoin and doing things to make it scale to more people. And so Elizabeth, she's the co-founder and CEO of Lightning Labs, which is a leading provider of software infrastructure for Bitcoin scaling. Hong Fang is the CEO of OKCoin, one of the earliest exchanges to integrate Lightning into their offerings. And Dario is the co-founder and CEO of Moon. So they provide wallet solutions for Bitcoin and Lightning so that people can use it with better and easier user interfaces. And so I'm going to start with Elizabeth and ask, how are we scaling Bitcoin to 1 billion people?
Thank you, Lynn. And first of all, it's such an honor to be speaking here today. Human rights is an issue that's absolutely near and dear to my heart and has inspired so much of my work and what I do. So thank you, everyone, to the incredible work you've done in this space. So when you hear the word Bitcoin, not everybody initially thinks of human rights. And access to global financial freedom. But actually, that is what this technology enables. And with Bitcoin, you have a global decentralized network that nobody can censor, that nobody actually controls. And that's what makes Bitcoin so incredibly powerful, is that nobody controls it, right? So we heard stories about, in the last panel, people where the government's cracked down, where somebody controlled it, where ultimately somebody took away somebody's money. And at the end of the day, how do people make a living? How do people raise funds? How do people stand up against authoritarianism? Well, they need access to financial freedom. So Bitcoin in its decentralized nature enables people to transact globally. But because it's decentralized, it means that it can't, at its base layer, have billions of people sending and receiving. Because of the way Bitcoin works, everyone on the network needs to know, that's running, say, a node, about all the transactions that have ever occurred. One analogy I like to use is, imagine if in order to send an email, you had to download every email that anybody had ever sent. That's how Bitcoin works at its base layer for people that are running nodes that are kind of like servers. So the solution that we as a community have been working on is called Lightning Network. We're going to talk about it today. A layer 2 on top of Bitcoin that enables instant high-volume transactions with low fees. And importantly, it's global, it's decentralized, and nobody controls it as well. So the idea is that Bitcoin, much like the internet actually, is built in layers, and we can have this layer 2 on top of Bitcoin where anybody can transact globally, and it can enable this kind of financial freedom around the world.
That's a great introduction for how this works. And from there, we want to get to how do we actually, who are the people that are kind of bringing this to people? And so exchanges have had their own speed in terms of how quickly they've integrated Lightning, and OKCoin was super early in terms of adopting Lightning. And so I want to ask you, what did you see in Lightning that made you want to get on this early, and what are you seeing as you've implemented this over time?
Yeah. Also, like Elizabeth, I feel very honored to be here. We integrated Lightning more than a year ago, March 2021, I believe. I think the whole thing, we need to go back to why we are building our platform, which is called OKCoin, a global crypto exchange to serve customers getting onto, into Bitcoin, buy Bitcoin, sell Bitcoin, and some of the other assets. Why we're building that? We actually have a lot of people on our team coming from very different backgrounds. And somehow we all share this passion of building an alternative system that is more transparent, that is more inclusive, that is not being controlled or biased toward one party or the other. And me personally, for example, I grew up in China, and I personally grew through the period when the country opened up to the external world and adopted a more free market-oriented approach. I ended up coming to going to US, and lived in the US for the last more than 16 years now, because I see more dynamics, more interesting innovations coming out of a free market environment. I actually worked in financial institutions with Goldman for almost 10 years. But what I've learned when I was at Goldman, particularly during the financial crisis, is that there is actually an element of imbalance, an element of unfairness in the system, in the current system. When we are talking about free markets, there was something that was not totally free. And I didn't realize that until actually in 2016 when I came across Bitcoin, when I realized, okay, this is something that actually represents a free monetary system that has never been done before in the way that it was designed, where the money is not created by any government, is not backed by any government or any central organization, but somehow can help people form consensus, thereby enable value transmission on a large scale between individuals. That in itself was unprecedented and can actually help us fix things. So that's how me personally got into Bitcoin and got into the space. We also have a lot of people on our team who, for example, came from Latin America. who, like some of the other panelists talk about, went through hyperinflation, and where their personal value and their family was under huge pressure in preserving the value that they're creating. We also have people migrated from former Soviet Union to United States, where when they were a kid, they had to move with their family members, with their parents, left everything behind in their native country, have nothing to start with. They have to start with scratch because all their wealth were left behind. They cannot bring anything with them. And with Bitcoin, if they had Bitcoin back then, it would be a totally different story. So there are so many people on our team with different diverse background, but coming to the same realization that if we want to build something different, if we want to give people, individuals, more empowerment, more control over what we want, how we are creating value, how we are preserving our value and wealth, how we are passing our wealth to the next generation or to whoever you want, we need a different system. And in building that system, the free markets is, again, the foundation that we have to do. That's why we are here to build a platform. But when we look at, for example, exchanges and the crypto markets, the earlier stages, crypto assets are very much speculative, highly volatile, and attract a lot of traders to the space, which in itself is fair. But one thing that we want to absolutely avoid is to be distracted into the wrong direction. As we started building on this, we want to make sure that we focus on the foundation. And Bitcoin, to us, is the foundation and anchor of the new system we're building. And that's why we want to be able to support building the use cases for Bitcoin. And the important use case, apart from the store of value, which made it a great asset for individuals and institutions, is the payment utility that we see in Lightning Network that made it actually possible. That's a long answer to your question, but that was really how we decided that we want to actually integrate Lightning to our product, even if it was probably the customer base asking for that. There's a increasingly stronger voice in our community asking for Lightning for various reasons. I can talk about that, but it's still a smaller portion compared to the larger population that are coming into the space and buy and trade the assets. But still, we feel like it's important to be able to help that network effect kick off earlier on, so that we can keep the integrity of Bitcoin as what it's designed to be.
And what kind of activity are you seeing on the nodes that you're running, and how's that? You said it's been a year so far, so how's that been going up to this date?
Yeah, we've been seeing decent growth in Lightning transactions that come through our nodes. We actually collaborated with Elizabeth's team to enable that. There are different use cases for that, but I would say, for customers who come to us and use Lightning, there are two main reasons for using Lightning Network. One is transaction fee, low transaction fee. 95% came to us, and because they think that the transaction fee through Lightning is fractional of what you would generally do on-chain through Bitcoin. The second is the speed of transaction. So for example, if you send a Bitcoin or receive a Bitcoin on the layer 1 protocol level, generally it takes about 10 minutes right now, 6 blocks, 10 minutes to confirm a transaction. But through Lightning, which is the second layer, it's almost real time. So about 90% also came to us through Lightning because of either lower cost or immediacy of the transaction. We've also heard from our customer base, some of them are even using Lightning to do monthly or weekly allowances for their family, for their kids, because it can be in small amounts and it's real time, and it gives them a sense of empowerment at a very early stage. So we found that to be very very endearing to us and make us feel good.
There's a community member named Bitcoin Rabbi who also wrote a children's book on Bitcoin, and he pays his kids their allowance with Lightning. So check that out.
Yeah.
And so years ago, when I kind of covered Bitcoin early, I thought about buying some, and then I ended up not buying it because the user interface was challenging back then. There was like a friction point, and I was like, I'll come back to that later. And then, of course, the years went by, I didn't buy it. And so one of the challenges of bringing this to so many people is that you have to make the user interface better. And so Dario, for example, focuses on building wallets that individuals like me and you can use in order to access this technology. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about kind of the challenges you see in the industry and what you think some of the solutions are, and for example, what's happening with Moon.
Sure. So I think what we are seeing right now in wallets, it's just like a prototype of what Lightning and Bitcoin should become eventually. There's still some challenges there, but we've had really great improvements in the last years. It's much more difficult to lose your Bitcoins if you're using a non-custodial wallet, which was traditionally a really big problem when using Bitcoin. Now we have integrated Lightning Network, which, as Hans said, it allows much faster payments and much cheaper payments. But there's still a lot of technical details that are leaked to the user that we should get rid of eventually if we want to have a billion users, if we want to have mainstream users that don't really care about the technical details, but they only care about solving a real problem that they have. There's still some work to be done there. We should work on education. We should work on scaling Bitcoin. Bitcoin still relies on the fact that not too many people are using it, so it works pretty well. But as we onboard more and more people, fees are going to get higher. So we need to focus on that. Lightning Labs has been working for quite a while on that problem. But I guess that making it easier for users, educating users, and making sure they don't lose their money are the main challenges for the next couple of years. And yes, so in Moon right now we are working on those problems. I think what we have right now is a really good initial version of tackling these problems, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I think making the Bitcoin experience really simple is important to onboarding mainstream users, to helping, say, human rights activists that need to solve a problem today to actually be able to access this technology and solve the problems. But yeah, there's still a lot of work there.
And you're from Argentina.
Yeah.
And so we were talking a little bit backstage about how you came to Bitcoin, because Argentina has a well-known inflation problem, pretty persistent, and so that the use case is pretty obvious there. It has rather high adoption in the country. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, sure. So back in 2001 in Argentina, there was a really big event called the Corralito. And the government was in really big trouble economically. And so they decided to freeze everyone's accounts. And you could only withdraw at first $300 per week. And eventually you couldn't withdraw anything from the bank, which was a really big thing in Argentina. It impacted almost everyone. Most people's entire life savings were frozen. So I think that Argentinians, in a way, have a really intuitive understanding about why self-custodianship is important, about why no one should be able, not a company and not a bank, not the government, should be able to freeze people's money. And so I guess that's one of the reasons that a really interesting early community formed in Argentina around Bitcoin and saw that as a way to solve their problems. And in 2014, I was working remotely for a company in the US. And they were paying me in the US, in US dollars, but I need to bring those dollars into Argentina. At the time, we had really strong currency controls. You couldn't bring in or out any money. And so I knew Bitcoin, so I used Bitcoin to bring that money inside Argentina, and it was kind of that magical moment, because until at that point, it was mostly theoretical. Like, I hadn't used it to solve something real. So it was super interesting to see it in action, but it was really hard to do so. So at that time, I started thinking about how we can make it so that this can be used by my parents, but everyone I know in Argentina. And yeah, and that's how I got started into thinking about usability for Bitcoin and making it eventually reach a mainstream audience.
And I guess, kind of touching on the next point here is, when it comes to using Bitcoin, it has a lot of advantages. I mean, as we've heard from the prior panel, basically having cryptographic money is super useful. It's decentralized, nobody can take it from you, no one can blacklist your accounts. But people do have to put up with volatility and other challenges. And so we're also seeing, in addition to Bitcoin adoption in multiple countries, we're also seeing stablecoin adoption. And stablecoins might not be as decentralized as Bitcoin, and they're not as inflation resistant, but they solve their own problems. And so, for example, in a number of countries, people can, if their local currency is having problems, they can have dollar deposits in their banks, but then a lot of times those get confiscated. Those get turned into the local currency. And so all that inflation protection gets wiped away from them. And so we've seen kind of increasing use case of stablecoins where, there's an external entity that, basically collateralizes those coins. And so while it's not decentralized, it at least separates the local government from the ability to kind of take those coins away from people. And for a while now, most of the stable coins have been on other blockchains, many of which are less decentralized than Bitcoin, or they're slow or expensive. And one thing that was, I think, very neat and announced recently is that Lightning Labs is working on a protocol to bring stable coins and potentially other types of assets onto Bitcoin. Because what we see with Bitcoin is that in addition to being an asset, it's also a network. You can transfer value, you can transfer, you can convert dollars into Bitcoin, send it over the Lightning Network, and then convert into any other local currency. And over time, that can get more and more native on the Bitcoin network. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what's going on with stable coins and Lightning and Bitcoin.
Definitely. So as you mentioned, you have this concept of Bitcoin, the asset. And Bitcoin was actually first proposed on Halloween, October 31st, 2008. So it's really relatively new. And then it wasn't until January 3rd, 2009, that the network of Bitcoin launched and really Bitcoin the asset. And for the first couple of years, what we saw was really people bought Bitcoin and they held it and they used it maybe as a store of value. But as of the last couple of years, and especially with the development of Layer 2 and Lightning Network that we're all working on here, we've really seen the emergence of Bitcoin as a monetary network. And the idea is that people can transact globally, instantly, at high volumes higher than something like a Visa or MasterCard with low fees. And one important point here, by the way, is the delta, the difference between all the people in the world, especially in emerging markets, especially in authoritarian regimes that have access to a mobile phone, and those that have access to the traditional financial system, right? And that is huge. If you look at a country like El Salvador, that recently, last year, adopted Bitcoin as legal tender, you have about 20 to 30% of the population with access to a traditional bank account, but a much higher percentage of the population with a mobile phone. So really, the idea here, and we'll get to stablecoins in a second, is that you can tap into this global monetary network, this internet of money, merely with a mobile phone, and that's incredibly powerful. So you're able to do that with Bitcoin, and you can send and receive Bitcoin. We've already seen this in Latin America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, many emerging markets globally. But now you actually add in the capability of having access to both Bitcoin and then, say, US dollar. We heard in the last panel about the idea that dollars can be hard to access globally. Well, what if anybody much like they can get access to the internet and access to information, could access, say, fiat currencies and dollars using the Bitcoin network. That's what we're working on as a community now. So my company, Lightning Labs, recently proposed a technology, a protocol called Taro. Some people might know of Taro root, really good chips. It's used in Latin America. Nigeria is the #1 exporter of Taro. My co-founder, Lalo, Nigerian American, and then also in Southeast Asia, so great food for those that like it. So Taro is a new protocol we propose to enable people to issue assets on top of both Bitcoin and Lightning. And what that means is anybody can then issue, say, $1. You've got $1, in a bank account. You might be one of these institutions in the US. People might issue euros, peso, kroner, etc. And then people can transact and send and receive like they would with Bitcoin. Now, as Lynn mentioned, there are going to be different trade-offs. This is going to be a more regulated approach, but it also provides far greater access. And what this means is anybody globally that wants to transact using Bitcoin can now send fiat currency over Bitcoin using both Bitcoin, the monetary network, and then also the way that it works on the Lightning Network is you're actually transacting from dollar to Bitcoin back to dollar. So now you're actually using Bitcoin as this monetary glue, really a central clearing point for all the world's currencies to transact through it. And what this means is the fees can be far, far lower than someone like a Visa that charges now 3% plus 30 to 60 cents per transaction. Well, what if I only want to send $1? The fees are going to be far too great. People are priced out. But globally now, anybody with access to a mobile phone can access something like the US dollar using Bitcoin as its rails, which is incredibly powerful for financial access.
One thing I would just add, because you mentioned Visa and MasterCard, I'm not sure how many people in the audience are actually paying attention to the capital markets, but Visa and MasterCard are the two biggest payment companies in the world. But the combination of their market cap is actually less than the size. Actually, probably not today, given the drop of the price. I would say 2 months ago, maybe, less than Bitcoin's market cap. So I think that in itself is actually a very powerful argument in the value of Bitcoin as the programmable global money network that in itself actually takes on life and evolve and take on adoption in different parts of the world without a centralized organization, without a centralized CEO driving to build it.
And by the way, not to mention cross-border payments, that's such a big financial flow, especially with regard to emerging markets, where fees can be upwards of 10% or more if you're sending something like $100 with something like a Western Union, a MoneyGram. But now, using Bitcoin as this global internet of money, people can send and receive, say, Bitcoin or fiat currencies instantly, at a very high volume for fees that are far, far lower than legacy players. So this really opens up access and opportunities for people globally.
I have one super excited about it, and one thing people can do is just download a wallet and try it out. Basically, there's so many free access points that people can kind of check out and just kind of get familiar with how the technology works. It's one of those things that sounds complicated at first, but it's like if you actually dig into how the current financial system works, it's extraordinarily complex. I mean, any transaction that seems simple on the surface, there's actually this Rube Goldberg machine underneath of permission companies handshaking each other, sending basically debt-based transfers around. Whereas what Bitcoin and the Lightning Network do is transfer real-time bare assets. And so we're running out of time here, but thanks so much for having us and enjoy the next panel.
Thank you.
I'll sit beside.
Come on in. We'll just confuse everyone.
I know.
Yeah, come on. It's a late afternoon here at Oslo, but I'm really excited to see so many of you here today. We're going to have what I think is going to be a very exciting panel discussion, and we're going to try to include some of your questions toward the end, so hope you'll stick around for that. I'm Scott Carpenter. I'm Director of Policy and International Engagement for Jigsaw, which is a unit within Google that explores threats to open society and tries to build technology that can scale to take care of some of those challenges. Today we're here to talk about the new tactics of the new authoritarianism and this ongoing war, as some of you heard me talk about this morning, has created what I think is a hinge point in history, where we don't know exactly which way it's going to tip as yet, but we have tremendous expectations and hopes for the way it goes. But it reminds me of, when the Berlin Wall fell at some levels, but then there was also Tiananmen Square that same year. So while Russia and its supporters have really defined the ongoing conflict as one between a clash of civilizations where one civilization or another civilization is on par with another, I think the struggle in Ukraine has really revealed that this is much more a contest between freedom and oppression, democracy and authoritarianism. This war, this contest that we're in, like every other thing that's happening in the world today, has both physical components and online components. The battlefield is online as much as it's offline. And typically this is in both the information space and in the cybersecurity sphere. So to discuss all of this, I am joined by these four experts who are each in their own right just amazing people that I've come to know and respect over the years. They are experts not only in their areas of expertise, but also passionate supporters of human rights and democracy. So from my far left, Yafa Frederick is a senior opinion editor at CNN. She was previously the managing editor of World Policy Journal, a quarterly foreign policy magazine, and a member of the Panama Papers team that won the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting in 2017. So thank you for that. Next, my colleague Beth Goldberg, who's a research manager, a terrific one at Jigsaw. She focuses on disinformation and violent extremism. And Beth has brought a unique character to our research program, as she's included ethnographic methods to the study of violent extremism and disinformation. She applies psychological approaches to develop countermeasures that inform both Google policy and product features. She's a human rights addict. She previously worked with human rights organizations Article 19, Freedom House, and Amnesty International. Next to her is sitting Rafal Rohozinski, a very old friend of mine who's the principal and founder of SecDef and Zero Point Security. Rafal previously served as an advisor to the UN and director of the Advanced Network Research Group at the University of Cambridge. A widely recognized expert in digital risk and cyber warfare, Rafal is also the author of numerous books and articles charting the geographical dimensions of the internet. Rafal has forgotten more than I will ever know about the subjects that we are going to discuss today. Finally, Glacier Kwong. Glacier is a digital rights activist from Hong Kong. She's now studying law at the University of Hamburg and is a coordinator at the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. But it was in 2014 amidst the massive popular protests that were taking place there, the Glacier's plea in a video to the international community to assist Hong Kong in the fight for democracy that was taking place at that point went viral, giving people around the world an on-the-ground perspective of the protests there. So these are our panelists, and I'm really excited to get into the conversation. So I was just talking about the fact that Ukraine and what's happening there may have changed things in one way or another. And I'm really curious to hear from you all what you think has changed and what is likely to change as a result of Ukraine in terms of the tactics that authoritarians are using right now. So maybe, Rafal, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I mean, this war is going to go down as World War D. This is the first war fought in the modern digital era between states. And what we've seen is cyberspace across all of its dimensions being utilized in that way. So we had the war that we expected to see, the cyber war we expected to see, weaponization of malware. And that went not so good for the Russians, largely because of the fact that there had been a massive investment into shoring up Ukraine's cyber defenses prior to this war. We've also seen the weaponization of social media platforms on a massive scale. The fact that the Ukrainians have done so well in the conflict has a lot to do with the fact that they've been managing to outpace the Russians in terms of its information component. Now that has both good qualities as well as qualities we'll need to watch in the future. But we've had two other dimensions that we haven't really seen before. First of all, we've seen the real cyber war, meaning military cyber war. The use of drones, the use of artificial intelligence, the use of small communication devices as a means of actually moving kinetic events on the ground. And that's been pretty significant and, again, a major, I think, shift in the way that we've thought about cyber war. But the last one, which is maybe the most important one, is we've seen economic warfare applied to cyberspace. And that means both in terms of sanctions that have crippled access to platforms such as Google's, such as Facebook's, such as AWS inside of Russia, and a kind of precedent that's being now set for expectations of other interstate conflicts where we may see these four new dimensions of cyberspace played out. So the history of the future is being written in the present here, and there's a lot to take away from that.
Wow, that's great. Yafa, would you like to respond to the same question?
Sure, hard act to follow. I would say in some ways it's changed the way we do journalism. So CNN has been relying on satellite companies to help us with the satellite imagery in Ukraine to really document the scale and to bring it to the masses. You know, we talk about televised wars, but this war is being televised in a way we've never seen a war televised before. And it's because media companies are actually working with technology companies to get the best picture of what's going on the ground. But the other side of that coin is that Russia is the king of disinformation. And they have a way of planting stories, whether it's through social media or through, in the United States, far-right news outlets that then become the mouthpiece for Russian disinformation. And that breeds confusion in Western populations. While most of the United States is firmly behind Ukraine, there's also a sizable portion that isn't. And why aren't they? And what are they watching? Are they being targeted by Russian bots? Or are they watching Tucker Carlson that night? So it's the pros and cons of how we live with disinformation, but also the ability to really document what's going on in real time.
Well, it seems like a good segue to you, Beth. What is your impression?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'll offer two observations about changes since the start of the war in Russian disinformation, and one is more substance and one is more change in style. The change in style is the way that pro-Russian propaganda is spreading has fundamentally changed. We've seen this unified and relatively decisive condemnation by the US and the EU of Russian aggression. And so Russia has expended relatively less energy online in spreading pro-Russian messages in European and English language. Instead, we're seeing a lot of pro-Russian accounts focusing on amplifying pro-Russian narratives in Chinese, in different languages within India, and with Russian speakers. There was a report recently by Mythos Labs where they found just last month that of all of the Russian sort of propaganda accounts on Twitter, a third of them had switched from before the war posting in English to posting in Russian. So we're seeing this pivot in the investment strategy of the disinformation campaigns. The second is a change in substance, a change of the narratives that are being spread. Refugees have always been one of the most sort of divisive sort of tools and focuses of Russian disinformation, and we're seeing a shift from talking about refugees and caricaturing them as dangerous and violent, right? We saw that a lot after the 2015 Syrian migrant crisis. But you can't do that same caricature today when 80% of the Ukrainian refugees are women and children. So instead, the narratives of disinformation about refugees today are caricaturing these women and these refugees as economic threats, as social threats. We're seeing disinformation that Ukrainian women are going to steal your husband. The kids are going to steal your kids' seats in the classroom, right? So it's a totally different framing of disinformation narrative.
I want to come back to you in a second, Beth, to talk a little bit more about that. But first, Glacier, from your perspective, with the war here in Ukraine, how is this playing out in a place like Hong Kong or Asia? How do you see it?
Thank you first. And I'd say it's very amazing to see what happens on Twitter, on social media in Hong Kong, as long as the war started. I think it was the only time since the national security law has passed that I have seen so many people posting about the same political event in Hong Kong. I think we Hong Kongers, it's safe to say we feel very strongly about what's happening in Ukraine because we do see other people who are living under the threat of authoritarian regimes as someone who's closely related to us. So we do feel very strongly about that, and then we start launching campaigns on our own, trying to raise money for Ukrainians because they were so supportive of our movement in 2019.
Wow.
And at the same time, because I'm currently residing in Germany, there's also a very interesting thing that I observed is help for refugees coming from Ukraine became so decentralized. Usually, what I learned about the asylum or the refugee system is that people just go into the bureaucracy of the German government and then they get arranged or treated in certain ways. But this time, there are a lot of people mobilizing themselves on Twitter, on Instagram, on different platforms, saying that I actually have a room. If someone is in need, they can actually come just to my place, or like give people different information about, oh, someone needs a computer for continuing school, like where can I get it? And then people just randomly come together and then form this sort of very amazing network that is somehow something very similar to what I've seen before, which is decentralized, leaderless effort, trying to make things happen. And I think this sort of mobilizing will fundamentally change a lot of things. Like people realize they don't actually need a central authority telling them, let's do A, let's do B, let's do policy, something, so that we solve the problem. People say, I can actually contribute as part of the solution, and then they will do it, which is, I think, will change a lot on how we view ourselves in this society anyways.
Just a quick follow-up there. Have you seen the kind of Chinese news networks get involved heavily in trying to shape the narrative in a place like Hong Kong about this fight?
Yes, indeed. Just simply looking at how pro-Beijing mouthpiece report on the war shows a lot, like how Chinese influence is there. They are basically shaping as some politicians in Hong Kong who are like very pro-Beijing basically say it's like a family dispute, like Ukraine is the spoiled brat in the family, and Russian is the mother as a father, is just restoring balance to the universe in that context, which is completely not true. And there are a lot of misinformation that's actually coming from Beijing. For example, they still don't call it a war until like very recently, like once or twice. But they keep calling it invasion, keep calling it a military operation, and then they play along and saying that Russia is right in defending the Western influence, and they are, like, it's NATO's fault or it's the US fault in general instead of the aggressor's fault. And they're also trying to mobilize Chinese citizens, the famous Wu Mao, on Twitter to troll everyone who thinks it's a war, and it's like unjustified. So we do see a lot of Chinese influence playing there, and especially when Huawei basically issued a media statement and then revoked it, saying that Huawei is on the road to aid Russia when it's facing cyber attacks. And then they took it back thinking it might be highly problematic and there will be further sanctions in the US or somewhere else. But it does reflect how Beijing feels so strongly about like being on the same side with Russia, because they're both like authoritarian regimes and they want the same things.
Interesting. Beth, Rafal mentioned that at the start of the war, there was probably a little less than we expected in the cyber domain initially. But certainly not the case in the information space. And as we talked about a little bit, Russia has really been hyping up and amplifying a lot of messages that are that touch on numerous conspiracy theories. And I was just wondering if you could reflect a little bit on what we have learned about the use of conspiracy theories, what the constructs of and structure of those theories are, and what we can take away.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'll actually start with a story to illustrate some of these conspiracy theories we're hearing now. So on my ride to the airport to come to Oslo, I had this very confident, emphatic young taxi driver tell me, well, inform me, Zelensky had started the war. And I said, oh, I'm going to switch into ethnographic mode here and start to actually interview this guy. So I started asking him more questions, and he informs me next that it's actually worse than you think. NATO is going to give Ukraine nukes. And when that happens, they're going to have the power to cripple Russia and bring Mother Russia to her knees. Now, why was a young New Yorker promoting and espousing these pro-Russian conspiracy theories to anyone who would listen to him in the back of his taxi cab? And what benefit does that provide to the Kremlin? There are a few things that I've learned from doing interviews like this one, this impromptu one, which is that conspiracies provide a really valuable tool because the cost of information repression keeps going up. So authoritarians are using this tool in the face of proliferating information channels when they find that the cost of censorship is too high or too hard. I think obvious exception here being China with so many levers of control over both social media and the infrastructure. But for authoritarians like Putin, they find that conspiracy theories can provide at least 3 really valuable means of controlling their people and people abroad. First, they can portray themselves as both David and Goliath. They can be the valiant crusaders and the righteous victims. So in the taxi, the driver said Putin was left without a choice. He was imperiled by both NATO and Ukraine. So he's seeing Putin as this victim, which then justifies him taking action. But beyond David and Goliath, conspiracies let authoritarians have a more coherent ideology. They can rely on this consistent architecture of an us and a them, right? And they're able to sort of demonize a them. And we saw this again. This taxi driver is talking to me about how Putin's worldview of anyone who's not defending Russian speakers must be against Russian speakers, right? It had this dichotomy. And lastly, I'll end with some ideas that I read from a fellow OFF attendee, Peter Pomerantsev, a Russian exile and author. And he talks about how conspiracies can engender powerlessness, and authoritarians can take advantage of this apathy and cynicism that are bred by conspiracy theories. And they make you think you need to rely on a strong ruler because you yourself are just powerless at the hands of a puppet master.
Yeah, that deep, deep sense of lack of agency can rob people of a lot of hope. And to that point, I wanted to come back to you to ask, you shared a little bit about what the reaction in Hong Kong has been to the war, but I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on kind of what the state of the movement is right now and how it's remaining robust, and how is technology helping Hong Kongers stay in touch with the outside world that can continue to affirm that they do have agency and to not lose hope?
Sadly, the situation in Hong Kong is not optimistic at all. Even as an activist, I won't lie and say I'm very hopeful and super optimistic about everything. After the government has passed the national security law in 2020 by passing our local legislature, they're basically criminalizing all speech and all political actions that is not praising the Beijing authorities in general. If you publish as a journalist, you get charged with seditious intent. Basically, if you publish something that the government doesn't like, for example, if you did an interview with me, then it will become a proof in court that says you're publishing seditious materials. And if you are a protester engaging in local protests, you are being seen as the local terrorists. And if you were like me, talking to foreigners, then I'm sorry, you're all my accomplices, and I'm colluding with foreign forces right now. And so this become a huge problem. And the thing about political movement, or political activities is that it has to be seen to be meaningful. Like if I made a speech and nobody came to it, it won't work. Like I'm basically talking to empty chairs, wouldn't have any political momentum in that sense. So technology actually plays a role to make political actions continue to be visible. For example, a lot of prisoners, political prisoners that are behind bars right now are writing behind bars, and then they publish it on like Patreon and Facebook on different platforms so that they are still heard by different people. Of course, they get warned by like prison authorities saying that, like, don't make a fuss about that. Please stop writing, basically. But they still do it. And it's also preventing Hong Kong from turning into a black box. Like with the aid of blockchain on different technologies, we're able to document, to archive, to store a lot of historical materials that are valuable and meaningful. And we are basically preserving the truth and history and historical records for Hong Kong. And it also made our work possible to be reaching out to the crowd in Hong Kong too. Like without internet, without technology, I won't be able to tell anyone that I'm doing the Oslo Freedom Forum. There's still someone who is interested in listening to the story of what's happening to the community of Hong Kongers. There are still people who are trying to work in the diaspora community to try to feed it back into the local context, and also make the connection between the local and diaspora community possible. Like, because the ultimate goal of having a diaspora movement is to be able to go home and to sip bubble tea at like a certain place, a certain time in that case. So these are all what technology is enabling us to do. And without it, I don't think I will be able to continue any of my work, to be honest.
Thank you, Glacier. That's a real honest answer, and I appreciate that. Yafa, you wrote a recent piece in December where you kind of cataloged and captured some stories of like-minded democracy activists who are kind of encountering the same types of challenges. Maybe you could summarize for us some of that work.
The key takeaways,
yeah. Key takeaways.
No, it only took me 3,500 words to do that one, so I'll do it. I'll try to do it in 500. Yeah, so I mean, I think what is really interesting is there are the shared struggles, right? And when we talk about democracy, I always say to my journalists in my newsroom, we don't use the word democracy in a lot of pieces because what does democracy mean to people? We need to be specific. And what we're finding with a lot of the dissidents we work with, they're talking about free and fair elections. They're talking about free speech. They're talking about the ability to protest without retribution. But they're also talking about social equality and economic equality. One of the dissidents we profiled for this particular series, because she is Muslim, she's discriminated against in a Buddhist nationalist government, as an example. And so she wants that sort of social equality. And those threads of free and fair election, social equality, economic inequality are the same, but they're also using a lot of the same technological tools. So whereas Glacier might use YouTube to spread her message, we have dissidents in Rwanda speaking up against Kagame on YouTube channels as well, right? Where we might have dissidents in Tanzania using Twitter to fundraise for political prisoners, you can see the same thing in Belarus happening as well. So they're employing a lot of the same tools. The flip side of that, of course, is that the authoritarian regimes are getting better at combating those forums, right? There are the simple ways that they do it, which is, or I call it the lazy dictator approach. We're just going to throttle the internet or shut it down for some period of time, right? When we expect that there's a protest, when there's an election coming up, when there's contested results that we know are going to come out of it. But then there are the more targeted ones. I think China and Russia are much better at this, Iran as well, right? We'll shut down specific sites so that they can't use those platforms to communicate. And so activists are turning to places like Signal and Telegram and getting more sophisticated with PGP codes. When I have sources come to me, I always ask them, like, what does your digital security, footprint look like? Tell me how you want to communicate, because we're probably not going to communicate through the channel you've just approached me on. And they are advancing in that too. They are getting smarter and they're sharing it. And it's from conferences like these too, where you meet activists in other spaces and you kind of learn best practices. But you always have to be like 3 steps ahead of the dictator who's right on your heels.
That's really, really interesting. When most people are coming to you these days, what channel are they using? I'm just curious. Would you say in a preponderance?
So I get the typical like cold pitch email, but then I use Signal primarily these days.
Okay, yeah, it makes sense. All right, Rafal, I have a question for you. Beyond the cyber warfare and the disinformation, authoritarians are also using a lot of technology to surveil their people. And there's been a lot in the news recently about what tactics and tools that they're using. But I'm curious from your perspective, what is the first and worst who are being targeted and what tools are being used?
Well, it's a great question, Scott. And for those of you who have not gone to the Citizen Lab set up downstairs that talks about specifically malware that targets phones, I greatly encourage you to go do that. There's a couple of different layers here. I think the punchline is this. Governments have gotten a lot smarter at understanding the levers they can use to control the internet across the entire stack. From the physical infrastructure to the tools that we use to being able to extend normal practices from law enforcement into effectively individualized surveillance. The challenge is this, the internet is like the great exception. It occurred, during this moment of time after the Cold War, which somehow defied the way that the world was organized, which is state-to-state relationships. The internet is the only one of the major infrastructures that we have globally that belongs to a multi-stakeholder approach, which means there is no center. Effectively, the way that the internet routes, the way that companies behave, somehow has been absent of this kind of normalized system of government-to-government communications. And that's tremendously dangerous. Because as governments become smarter on this, we're going to see the space that allows you to act as a human rights operator, for example, suddenly become more and more constrained. Right now, one of the biggest challenges that we have to internet freedom is not surveillance. It's the Chinese government getting involved in standards bodies that are going to define what the internet looks like as an experience for all of us in the next 15 years. It's the fact that we in the West are adopting smart city technologies that are providing precise surveillance of where we are as individuals in order to improve our consumer experience. That's where the real danger is coming from. And the challenge is this, just like you were talking about your sources now starting to be better on signal, the donor community that supports effectively what all of us do here in the world don't understand three really important words: digital duty of care. And that is to ensure that anything that you do here in this room takes into account the changing governance structures of the internet globally, and what it takes to keep you safe in terms of what you're doing. Just to give you an example, Scott, my government, Canadian government, insists that when I put in a proposal that works with Syrian activists, I have to send them an unencrypted email with the name of every activist I'm working with. Okay? Think about that from an opposite point of view. If I want to make a transaction to an activist that's working in Kyrgyzstan, my bank, under Know Your Client, an AML, insists that I give all the details for that individual, even though that transaction may put them at risk. So we have a complex problem here. On one hand, donors not being aware of what digital duty of care means, and governments getting much, much smarter in terms of understanding the levers that exist in the states that can combat the great exceptionalism of the internet and make it a far more insecure space for all of us.
Thanks for that, Rafal. I just wanted to note that there are a couple of members of Jigsaw here who are working on a number of those standards and trying to find ways of combating that across our platforms. Not easy. And as you note, the Chinese have really flooded the zone when it comes to standards, especially at the ITU, which is a place that the multi-stakeholder framework does not obtain. So deeply problematic. But Glacier, coming back to you, given what Rafal has just said, how do activists in Hong Kong access the internet? How do they continue to access the outside? What are the tools that they're using?
It comes at certain levels, like how do we circumvent the risk that you talked about, which is basically all true in the context of Hong Kong too. Before 2019, I would say we were completely hopeless, to be polite, because we don't educate ourselves enough. I would be one of the few people on Signal and have no friends to talk to in general, because they don't use it. And then you're like, okay, so I'm the only one on PGP Mail or Signal. But then things started to change when political activity started to be very vibrant in 2019. People start to educate themselves about, basically if you're talking about something sensitive, use Signal, open self-destruction, do all the precautions you need, get a burner phone, get a burner SIM, and don't take a burner phone with you all the time, and all of those things. So people start to educate themselves. But it's not enough, because education takes a long time, and you cannot expect everyone is tech savvy enough to know how to navigate, like how do you delete data safely, how do you use like certain very complicated tools. Even I struggle to implement it on a daily basis myself. And I'm already like well-trained in that field as an activist, and I find it very difficult too. So the problem actually comes to people don't actually have access to certain things. And I know that it will happen soon because the government is already threatening to to ban Telegram recently in Hong Kong. I'm not sure that they can do it because Russia failed anyway, so I'm not sure how do they actually do it. But if they start to ban VPNs like they did in China, or if they start to ban foreign medias, I wonder how many people actually know how to get a VPN when it's not available in an app store. Or how do we circumvent that and still access certain websites for information? And so the trick is always to step up your own security game and to try to help other people step up your security game. And there are a lot of people working on the ground in Hong Kong trying to provide those education. But then again, they lack funding, they lack resources. And it's impossible to actually directly give them funding. You can't just get money from a foreign organization that supports this kind of work, even though it's not political at all, to just transfer them the money, because they will immediately be seen as colluding with foreign forces again. And at the same time, the legislations in Hong Kong isn't helping a lot. Like, for example, our privacy ordinance basically allow data transfer to third party without our consent and without any regulation. And sadly, it's the same as happening in Europe too. There is something called the standard contractual clauses in Europe under a 2021 judgment called Schrems II. You can basically transfer any data outside of the European Union to a third country, be it the US, be it China under that. And with many users in Europe using Chinese-made applications or services, it's very likely that their data are being transferred and being analyzed somewhere else for other purposes. And European governments aren't doing anything about it, or they're not planning to, at least from what I've seen. And these things all adding up, making it very difficult, and it's all the burden are being put on the users to defend ourselves, to reduce digital footprints, to choose very carefully what kind of tools we're using. And another way to go is for activists like me, who is outside of Hong Kong, trying to push for these legislation changes. Like, are we taking into consideration what are these laws having an impact on people, not only in Hong Kong, but example, outside of Hong Kong? If App Store policies doesn't change, it's possible that people in Burma again won't have access to Proton Mail or Proton VPN again, so what do? And a lot of the times these questions are ignored in foreign legislatures when they're thinking about these kind of legal frameworks, and that has to change in order for some of the burden to be lifted from our shoulders as activists and daily users of technologies.
That's really great advice. Really great advice. I think there's some people in the room who can help take action on some of that. Yafa, I joined Google right at the beginning of 2011, where at a time when technology was going to be the liberator. And I know that you were covering those events as well. I was curious, given what you've heard both Rafal and Glacier talk about, how do you reflect on where we are right now and where we're going?
No, I mean, it's amazing. When I think back to January 2011 and Tahrir Square, and it was called the Twitter revolution back then. Some even called it the Facebook revolution. 60% of Facebook and Twitter users in Egypt back then were under the age of 30. And it took the government a few days to block Twitter and Facebook, and then to eventually shut down the internet but there was a delay. The government had to catch up because the people running the government were not under the age of 30, and they were just hearing of Twitter for the first time. And you think of it today, it's instantaneous or it's preemptive. I mean, Tanzania did this before the last election. We'll just shut down the internet before the election even happens because we know that there's going to be people who are going to oppose the way we might manipulate the results. So the challenges, the magnitude of the challenges, even though there are more tools in the toolbox, right? Even though there are signals and telegrams and Proton, the dictators are also, again, right on our heels. I probably feel repetitive. But to your point, I think a lot of lawmakers in the West don't think about this as much when they are creating legislation that has global implications. And so, one of the big themes of the conference is that what happens in one country really does impact people in the other. I've seen this a lot with the war in Ukraine now because Americans who, no offense to my own people, but it's very easy when there's an Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean separating you from huge land masses to kind of say, that's happening over there, that's not my problem. Suddenly your gas price is going up, your supply chain is interrupted because Shanghai has a lockdown, and you start to pay attention and you start to be a little bit more politically engaged, which is why I think it's an opportune moment to revisit these conversations with legislatures across the world as they are passing these laws that have implications of what happens with our data. The EU and the US are like dramatically different places on what they do with data right now, or what they don't do with data. And there needs to be more consistency, I think, on an international level, at least amongst Western democracies on this, if you have any chance of, again, being 3 steps ahead of the dictators on it.
I think that's absolutely right. And our CEO, Jared Cohen, has written a lot about techno-democracy and having democracies come together to sort some of these things out. The challenge is that democracies right now don't seem to agree on anything when it comes to the internet, anything when it comes to privacy and transparency and data regulation, and so we need to get our own house in order pretty quickly, it seems to me. Beth, I want to come back to you on this battle on disinformation online. Because I kind of let you off the hook in the first question. I asked you to describe the problem, admire the problem for a little bit, but what can we do about that problem? Are there approaches that we're considering that could lead to meaningful change?
Yeah, I'll offer one little glimmer of optimism after all of the sort of, authoritarians on the rise stories we've been hearing over here. We've learned a lot from understanding how debunking can work. We've been looking at sort of these post hoc fact checks or corrections, and it's difficult at best, and it's often insufficient to actually affect people's beliefs. So we've been experimenting with a really promising approach at Jigsaw called prebunking. Some of you may have heard of this as inoculation theory. The goal here is to build a familiarity and a resistance to disinformation before you encounter it. So that's why it's the prebunking to counter the debunking. And it's based on this communications technique I mentioned called inoculation theory, where you're sort of, think about it like you're building mental antibodies. You're building mental armor against an unwanted information attack. So it's just like the body is building physical antibodies against an unwanted future virus encounter. Now, there's nothing actually medically invasive or voodoo here about prebunking. It's actually kind of like a public service announcement, except that instead of someone just patronizingly telling you, like, hey, don't smoke, it's a much more self-defense framing. It's saying, hey, tobacco companies are going to try to make smoking look really cool. They're going to show you these advertisements with really sexy, main characters, and they're going to tell you that there are no risks involved. Actually, here are all the risks, and here's what that advertisement looks like, and here's how you can say no, right? And so it's this sort of more educational framing that says, here's how you can equip yourself the next time you spot misinformation. So the reason this works so well with conspiracy theories in particular is because we can predict what the next conspiracy theory is going to be. The thing with conspiracy theorists is they all start to repeat a lot of the same tropes. You'll hear them use the same narratives, the same rhetorical techniques. And so we can predict, hey, Putin's likely going to use fear-mongering. Or when he talks about Ukrainian refugees, he's likely going to scapegoat them, right? We can identify these same techniques, and then we can get out ahead of them with prebunking. So for the last about 2 years or so, Jigsaw has been doing some research with some of Paul's colleagues actually at Cambridge University. And we've been making these 30-second videos. And in just 30 seconds, we can help prebunk someone, help give them mental antibodies against something like scapegoating or fear-mongering. And we found that that's effective, at least for a week or a month at a time. And so we're testing now, how do we boost someone's immunity and get them, resistant to disinformation over even longer periods of time? So I think, we'll keep experimenting with this approach, but I think this is the type of thing that we could scale for millions of people in the years to come.
Well, thank you, Beth. What I'm struck by is the connection between what you said at the beginning and now. Is just that we know in the context of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine that the Russians are going to start to figure out new ways and new narratives to target Western democracies with lots of elections coming up on the question of what are those immigrants taking away from you? What are these governments doing? So we'll watch that space. Well, I promised you 15 minutes of questions, and instead we have 9 minutes and 38 seconds. If there are questions that you have, please raise your hand, and I think there's a microphone out there. Yes, this gentleman in the back there. If you could state your name, your organization, and then your question, and please, questions go up at the end.
I'm Rick Botello. I'm a family physician.
A little
I'm
louder.
Rick Botello, and I'm a family physician. I don't usually come to these conferences, but I have a great interest in the issue of equity. My question is focused on the dark side of this picture is pretty abysmal, and it's much easier to manipulate the reptilian and the amygdala brain than it is to use what I heard you describing as calling out the anti-authoritarian playbook. You preface it, you say this is what they're going to do, this is how they're going to manipulate and whatever. I think that is helpful to a certain degree from a public health strategy, yes. But I think we have to think much broader than that and think about how do we actually use the metaverse to actually create ongoing learning communities that enable us to co-create the future we want to have. So how can we flip from this dark side, which is so pervasive and overwhelming, to a world where we can actually imagine a metaverse that is lifelong learning and how to deal with these wicked problems?
Thank you for the question. And I think probably each panelist might have something to say on this, but why don't I start with Beth and we'll just go right down.
Well, I would love to join this metaverse learning community. That's the best use of the metaverse that I've heard anyone come up with so far. So sign me up. No, I think you're absolutely right that we need to be looking at public health for a lot of strategies for getting out ahead of what is essentially information viruses, right? Information disorders. And so I think there's a lot that we could be learning from physicians like yourself. I'll pause there.
Yeah, first of all, I'd say I'm a huge advocate of the public health approach. And I think the one thing about it that's really important is that it's evidence-based and that it's continuous. In other words, you don't have an endpoint. You have protective factors and you have risk factors. You identify the risk factors, you identify the protect factors, and you iteratively go forward with it. We work a lot with violent extremist communities in places like Bangladesh, Yemen, and elsewhere. And we've learned that being able to identify the protective factors is about 75% of the battle in terms of being able to reduce the risk that occurs to communities that are affected by everything from disinformation to violent extremism. But it's poorly understood. It's also really important because it gets us away from this idea of surveillance just being police surveillance or state surveillance. Folks, there's a proper use of surveillance in public health in order to understand what are protective factors and what are risk factors. But we need to adopt that language and not see it as being harmful, but rather seeing it to addressing exactly the category of problem that you've identified.
I'd say I'm strongly for a solution to that because being an activist means you're somehow like a victim to all of the stress that comes from social media. There are times I would just like go into caveman mode and have to turn off everything just that I have like a sense of inner peace in that sense. I actually don't know what the proper solution is because like when it comes to like content moderation, that kind of stuff, it always comes with another bunch of problems that you have to solve. Like who gets to decide? What if AI gone wrong? Do you have human doing that? Then what happens to the human that is exposing to all of those risks and stuff? And I just think there is still a long way to go, and we are just beginning that discussion very recently, and it's very problematic, and we have to like kind of speed up so that we all can be happy human beings in general.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I actually think the American support for Ukraine is an application of this because for months before February 24th, there were leaks to outlets like CNN and others from the intelligence community saying Putin is planning an invasion. And I can't tell you how many pieces I published with X number of Russian troops are at the Ukraine border. I mean, it was weekly. It was like we were priming the American public for what was about to happen, so that when it did happen, the polling across party lines, and Americans don't agree on a whole hell of a lot these days, was actually fairly consistent despite the disinformation contingency that still does manifest in the United States. But it was like we were priming, and we were a part of that equation. I think mainstream media plays a role in that, but it also depends on our sources, right? And so I'm always very much encouraging people to be good sources for us, to give us the intelligence that we don't have access to, because we can at least be responsible, or try to be at least, in how we share that, especially when we think a dictator is about to take terrible actions.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that story that's going to be written, maybe by Josh or others in this room, about what happened. Like, it was such a brilliant use of prebunking, and prebunking with the truth, and in such detail that there was no way of avoiding or not seeing it. So thank you for the question. Thank you for each of the panelists. We have another question over here. And folks, I really apologize for this, but we have 3 minutes and 55 seconds right now.
That's a lot of pressure. Thank you. It was a wonderful panel. My name is Alia Malik, and I guess relevant to this, I direct international reporting at the Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY, and we spend a lot of time sort of teaching, disinformation, why it works upon us. And for future journalists, obviously, journalists have perpetuated disinformation. And as a Syrian and as somebody who covers Syria, disinformation was very critical in sort of paralyzing the international community into taking any action. So my question is to Beth, because that was very interesting what you said, this idea of how you're going to preemptively debunk, preemptively sort of fill people with antibodies. But one of the things we look at is that, one of the theories of communication is not just to transmit information, it's ritualistic. It's to sort of confirm your worldview and to connect, right? All the reposting on social media that people do without reading sometimes is because it sort of reaffirms your place in that community that thinks in a certain way. And one of the reasons it's been so effective is because there's always a little bit of a kernel of truth that conforms with this worldview. So how are you going to inoculate people in these sorts of messages? Because you have to sort of, how are you going to get to the kernel of truth problem? How are you going to sort of deny that, yes, there have been bad faith actions by the United States that doesn't somehow negate Russia's bad faith actions? And how do you separate people from the tribes and the communities with which that they're sharing this sort of disinformation with, which is sort of part of identity?
Thank you for the question. It's a good one, and I will direct it to whom you asked it.
Thank you.
Beth.
That's a wonderful question. You're hitting on all of the parts of disinformation that make it so sticky and intractable, right? It's tied up in our identities. It's tied up in the tribes that we're part of. One of the ways that prebunking tries to get around that is by zooming out away from the individual claim, right? If there's an individual claim that this particular politician did X, that's going to immediately rile up all of that sort of tribal affiliation, right? And you're going to immediately have this knee-jerk response of either support or antipathy. But if you zoom out and you're actually prebunking at the level of a meta-narrative, or even higher at the level of a rhetorical technique like fear-mongering, that becomes very apolitical. It's actually much more cerebral. And so I found myself, after having created some of these videos about scapegoating or fear-mongering, noticing that some of the content that I enjoyed consuming was actually using fear-mongering, and it was trying to emotionally manipulate me. And I was like, wait, I really like this, documentary producer. I really like this, influencer, but I think they're trying to manipulate me right now. And it made me pause. And so I think that's what we're going for here. We're going for the pause, and we're not necessarily trying to prebunk every specific claim that, like you said, will really tap into people's deep-seated identities and beliefs.
Well, my friends, we're coming to the very end here, and that last question is a really profound one that we're all going to have to grapple with, because there's a society in Russia, for example, that has been fed many lies at scale for a very, very long period of time. And so there is a question about how do we reach people. What's it going to take to have people see what the reality is in Ukraine, and it is not what they're being told. So I think it's a really great question, and I look forward to working all of us together on solutions. But before we end, Yafa, Glacier, Rafal, Beth, I just want to thank you so much for this conversation. I think we've all benefited a lot from it, so thank you.